Tom looked at me seriously and said, "If you don't want to live with my parents, then we're getting a divorce." I wanted to respond, but he started yelling at me like we were having a big argument. I'm the only child, so it's my responsibility to take care of my parents. You knew that when we got married, and now you're saying you don't want to live with them? That's not going to happen. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say back. It's not that I didn't want to live with my in-laws, but I was really stressed out because my husband and his parents made unreasonable demands on me. Tom had been spoiled growing up. He got whatever he wanted, and his parents always praised everything he did. When he was in college, his parents even bought him an expensive bed just because he said his old bed was too hard. Even after we got married, his parents continued to make unreasonable demands. For example, when I bought a big bag of chicken thighs to cook for dinner, my mother-in-law, Clara, criticized me. "Stella, Tom has been complaining that your cooking isn't good because you keep making chicken thighs. They're cheap, but you should cook better meals sometimes." So, I tried making pork steak, but then my father-in-law, Richard, complained, too. "Isn't pork steak something poor people eat? Since Tom is working hard, you should make him a beef steak. He deserves better than this." Every time my in-laws said things like this, I felt so stressed out. But I knew that since Tom was an only child, this would eventually come up, and I had to be ready for it. I also grew up as an only child, but my dad, Bob, raised me on his own. We were comfortable financially, and my dad did all the housework. He was proud of me and always told me not to worry about him. He'd say, "I know you already have a lot to deal with, especially with your in-laws. Don't worry about me, Stella." Those words from my dad helped me handle the stress from my in-laws. But then, my dad passed away. At the funeral, Sam, my dad's friend, told me that my dad had been sick with cancer for years, but didn't tell me because he didn't want to worry me. I didn't notice anything was wrong with him, so I was shocked and heartbroken when I found out. At the funeral, Clara and Richard didn't show any sympathy for my loss. Instead, they told me I needed to take care of them since I was Tom's wife. They said, "You have to take care of your old parents. We're getting old, too." It was so rude and hurtful that I wanted to argue with them, but then I thought of my dad's smile and his kind words, which helped me hold back. Later, I found out that my dad had left me a large piece of land in New York. Sam showed me the will and said, "This land is in a great location. Don't waste it." When I got home, I was reading the will when Tom grabbed it from me. He was excited and said, "What do you think about building a two-family house on the land and living there with my parents? Doesn't that sound like a good idea?" I was shocked. "Why is Tom making decisions about land that's mine?" He said, "We should act quickly. I've been thinking about living with my parents, and now this land came up. It's perfect. I think it's a sign from God that we should build a two-family house." I was frustrated. "I don't think that's a sign from God." I took a deep breath and told him, since this land came from my father, I should decide how to use it. "Let me think it over." Tom got angry and yelled, "Wives' things belong to their husbands too. You've been living off my money, and now you're saying this land is only yours? That's not fair." I tried to stay calm. "I'm not saying it's only mine, but I inherited it, so I get to decide what to do with it. If you have a better idea, I'm open to hearing it." Tom crossed his arms and stared at me, waiting for me to say something. "I can't think of anything right now. This is all happening too fast." He said, "I knew you wouldn't have a better idea. Wait. Let me look into it and figure out the best way to use the land," I insisted. "We don't have time to think about it," Tom said, turning his back on me. At that moment, I knew we weren't going to agree, and I couldn't say anything more. After the conversation about the land, I tried to talk to Tom several times, but he refused to listen. He would only say, "We're building a two-family house," over and over. Sam, the friend of my father who had spoken to me at the funeral, called me a few times to check on me. After my dad passed away, Sam was the only person who gave me comfort. Talking to him helped me stay calm and strong, and he listened to everything going on between Tom and me. 6 months later, I got a call from someone who claimed to be from a big home building company. "The house you ordered is almost finished. Can we set a date for your final payment?" the person asked. I was confused and asked, What house are you talking about? The caller seemed surprised and said, the house was ordered 6 months ago. I immediately went to Tom and asked, did you order a house behind my back without telling me? Tom answered without apologizing, saying, you were taking too long to make a decision, so I went ahead and made it for you. I was upset. You did it without even talking to me. That's wrong. Tom shrugged it off. If I hadn't made the decision, nothing would have happened. You wouldn't have agreed to anything, and we'd still be stuck. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What do you mean I wouldn't agree? Is it wrong for me to have a say in what happens to my land? Tom just kept repeating, it's not your land. I told you before, wives' things belong to their husbands too. I was frustrated. But you should have talked to me about it first. Tom sighed loudly and muttered, what a pain, then said, you really don't want to live with my parents, huh? I responded, that's not the issue. I have the right to decide how the land is used. But Tom didn't seem to care. Fine. If you don't want to live with my parents, let's just get a divorce. I was shocked. Was my husband really threatening me with divorce just because I didn't agree to his idea of building a house for his parents and us? Tom told me, I'm the only child, and it's my duty to live with and take care of my parents. You knew this, so you have no right to say no, and because of this, I'm leaving you. I signed the divorce papers without hesitation. I was treated unfairly, and my love for Tom was gone. All I felt was frustration and stress from his parents. They kicked me out, but honestly, I didn't mind. My only regret was losing the land my father had left me. I called Sam and told him what had happened to the land. That must have been tough, Sam said. His voice was kind and full of sympathy, but then he said with more confidence, don't worry, we'll get that land back. I was confused. What do you mean? Sam didn't answer my question, but just smiled. After the divorce, I moved into an apartment. I was looking for a job, but I wasn't in a rush because I had a plan for my future. My only real concern was the land I inherited from my dad. I didn't understand what Sam meant, but I decided to trust him because he was a good friend of my father's. Then I got a call from Tom. You signed a contract to build a mansion on that land? Why didn't you tell me? You tricked me, didn't you? He shouted. Wait, what? I asked, confused. I just got sued by the construction company for building the house on that land, Tom said angrily. Since I was talking to Sam when Tom called, I gave Sam the phone. Sam smiled and started talking to Tom. Hey, Tom, you're being too loud. Don't you know how to talk to a lady? What you're saying sounds like moral harassment. Huh? Who are you? Tom asked. I'm an old friend of Stella's father, Sam replied. I know all about the land. Stella's father made the contract to build the mansion before he passed away. He knew that you and your parents would try to take the land without Stella's permission, so he made sure the house was built before you could do anything. Tom was silent for a moment. Why didn't I know about this? Because you took the will away from Stella before she finished reading it, Sam explained. You only read part of the will, didn't you? I remembered that Tom had taken the will from me before I could finish reading it. He never let me see it again. Sam continued. Stella told me everything. When I heard the truth, I thought you would cancel the contract on your own, but I kept quiet. I knew it. You tricked me, Tom shouted. No, you did this to yourself, Sam said. I could practically hear Tom gritting his teeth on the other end of the phone, and I felt good about it. Sam handed the phone back to me. Stella, you have something to tell him. I took the phone and said, yes, Tom, I have something to say, and it's something you'll regret. This is why I took my time. I needed time to figure out how to make sure you and your parents regret treating me this way. Tom, you'll be getting a claim for damages and alimony soon, I said calmly. What? Tom sounded confused and upset. Since you used my land without my permission, I did my research. I found out that I can claim damages if a house is built on my land without my approval. Tom sounded angry. You've got to be kidding. I stayed calm. It wasn't without permission, because what belongs to the wife belongs to the husband. Tom yelled, but I'm not your husband anymore, am I? I smiled to myself. That's right. We're divorced now. The land is still mine, and because we're divorced, you and your parents have no right to it anymore. Tom was silent. I continued. Oh, and by the way, all our conversations about the house and land were recorded. I have proof that you tried to force me to agree to build a two-family house on my land. Every time I disagreed, you harassed me, and I have all of that recorded. I gave the recording to my lawyer. This is for the alimony, I added. I heard Tom swear on the other end of the phone, then he hung up without saying anything else. I couldn't believe it when Tom called again. This time, his tone was completely different. He sounded upset, almost like he was about to cry. Stella, I'm sorry, I really am. You're the only one for me. Please, let's get remarried. I couldn't believe his words after everything he had put me through. I don't trust you anymore, I replied. You and your parents have treated me terribly. I'm really sorry. I'll apologize as many times as it takes, Tom begged. I knew exactly why Tom was so desperate. After I spoke with my lawyer, it became clear that Tom and his parents had to tear down the house they built on my land and return it to me. The eviction from the house they had built and the lawsuit from the construction company meant they had no place to live anymore. That's why Tom was trying to win me back, hoping I would drop the lawsuit and save them. He even suggested I could buy the house they had built, but I refused. After everything they'd done to me, I wasn't going to show them any mercy. I decided to have the house demolished. Then, Clara called. We're old, and we don't have much time left. I can't imagine being homeless. I'm sorry if I've caused you trouble. Can we have another chance? But I refused to listen. Clara lashed out, calling me a devil. To me, it was just the desperate cry of a loser. I calmly said, whatever. The house was demolished, and the land was returned to me. The mansion was built, and now I have a steady income from tenants. On top of that, I'm receiving compensation from Tom and his parents every month. As for Tom and his family, they ended up moving into a cheap apartment. They are struggling to pay off their debts, the damage compensation and alimony to me, the loan for the demolished house, and the damage to the construction company. Tom is working a second job, Clara has a part-time job, and Richard is cleaning restrooms in a shopping mall. I'm watching over them to ensure they make the payments on time. I won't help them, though. They made their own bed.
Judith grew up without a mother. Her mother died when Judith was still a toddler, leaving her with only vague memories that surfaced occasionally. It's understandable, as Judith was only 4 years old when her mother succumbed to a heart attack. As Judith grew older, she learned that doctors had strongly advised her mother against pregnancy, warning that she might not survive it. However, her mother's desperate desire for a child led her to take the risk. Initially, contrary to medical predictions, both the pregnancy and birth progressed smoothly. Judith's mother radiated happiness beside her long-awaited daughter. Hope blossomed that they had defied the odds. Sadly, the illness eventually took its toll, and the young woman's health deteriorated rapidly. Despite their best efforts, doctors couldn't save her. Judith's father faced an immense challenge. Not only had he lost his beloved wife, but he was also left to care for a young child alone. With grandparents living far away, he had to manage on his own, mixing the duties of a father with a senior position at a plant, a demanding job that required maximum involvement, including night shifts, unexpected calls, and frequent overtime. Partly out of desperation and partly out of loneliness, Judith's father remarried quickly. Jacqueline initially presented herself as an ideal stepmother, spending time with Judith, taking her for walks and dressing her in beautiful clothes. Judith, desperately craving maternal affection, embraced Jacqueline wholeheartedly. Then Judith's half-brother Paul was born, and Judith found herself suddenly relegated to the background. A change both noticeable and hurtful. She tried hard to regain the adult's approval, but to no avail. Her father seemed to stop noticing her, while Jacqueline began to view Judith as a hindrance, annoyed by her very presence. This dynamic became the new normal. Judith grew up receiving only reproaches and criticism from her parents. New purchases for Judith became rare, as Paul's expensive hockey lessons took priority. Her problems went unnoticed, and any requests were met with lectures about the dangers of spoiling, teenage selfishness, and budget constraints. "We're not rich. Do you need a new phone? The old one still works fine," Jacqueline would snap. "But the camera is broken," Judith would reply. "Then you should have been more careful with it." Judith was compelled to get back on her feet and start living on her own sooner than later. "Your father and I aren't here to support you until you get married. We simply can't afford it," Jacqueline declared. Judith understood. Of course they wouldn't. They wanted her to grow up quickly and leave, as she had become an obstacle to their happiness. Judith felt uncomfortable in her own home. Her stepmother was hostile, her half-brother spoiled and dismissive. How else could Paul treat her, given their parents' behaviour? And her father remained indifferent, a stranger. Yet Judith knew he could be tender, loving and caring. She saw it in his interactions with Paul. This stark contrast deeply wounded Judith. By the school graduation, Judith had accepted her situation. She dreamed of graduating from medical college, finding a job, renting a place, and moving away from her indifferent relatives. Judith's desire to become a doctor stemmed from her mother's death. Having experienced the challenges of growing up as an orphan, she was determined to save other children from a similar fate. She believed that helping even one person would make it all worthwhile. Judith knew she couldn't attend university immediately after school. Her stepmother made it clear that no one would support her for long, and her father increasingly emphasized independence. So Judith enrolled in the local nursing school, excelling in her studies as always. After graduation, she left for the state capital. The move offered better job prospects and distance from her family. She harboured no ill will towards them. It simply seemed better for everyone to be apart. As Judith departed, her stepmother issued a final warning. "Paul has tutors now, plus hockey is expensive. We need to do repairs. You understand? If we were rich, things would be different. But we're in a tight spot. You'll have to rely on yourself. Find a good job. And don't get pregnant in the city. We can't support you and your child if anything happens." Judith merely grinned. What child? She had different plans. She wanted to work and study, simultaneously focusing on becoming a doctor before considering children. Of course, Judith dreamed of having her own family someday. She envisioned herself as a mother, perhaps even to multiple children, with a loving and understanding husband by her side in a spacious, cosy apartment. She longed to care for someone and receive care and attention in return. She wanted to escape her loneliness and feel needed. But all of this lay in the distant future. For now, work and studies came first. Judith secured a job as a nurse in a private clinic. The pay was good, enough to live on, rent a small apartment and save a little. She was fortunate to get into this medical centre immediately, thanks to one of her former teachers who knew the owner and recommended Judith as one of his best students. Gradually, Judith acclimated to the big city and independent life. Freedom. No one dictated what she could or couldn't take from the refrigerator. No one looked at her with irritation. The feeling of always being in someone's way vanished. Judith felt as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had long dreamed of this moment, but couldn't have imagined the relief she'd feel. It seemed to Judith that now nothing was impossible, that all roads were open to her. It was as if she had wings. New friends appeared, colleagues, young nurses. They often invited Judith to the movies, bars and clubs. It was exciting, a novel. For so long the girl's life had consisted only of studies and home, where her stepmother, who had an unfavourable attitude toward her stepdaughter, ruled. Now Judith embraced life fully. She had fun with friends, dressed beautifully, and worked. She didn't stop learning either. Judith pored over textbooks to improve herself professionally and prepare for her upcoming entry into the medical academy. She understood it would be incredibly challenging. She'd probably have to give up her beloved job and find something with a more flexible schedule, This, of course, meant a significant loss in income. Medical academy students have little opportunity for part-time work, as all their time must be devoted to study. Judith needed to save a tidy sum to live on during this period. That's why she opened a bank account, where she now transferred a significant portion of her salary each month. From time to time, her friends invited her to travel. Of course, she wanted to see the world, but Judith had a goal, and she was determined to achieve it. Then Ray appeared in Judith's life, and she suddenly seemed to forget her plans, overwhelmed by strong feelings. Judith met Ray in a bar. She and the girls had come in before the weekend to listen to music, chat and laugh, and, admittedly, to flirt and get their share of male attention. It was always so uplifting. While Judith's friends were already thinking about marriage, she didn't want anything serious yet. The girl remembered her goal, and relationships, let alone family life, didn't fit into her plans at all. Judith thought her mind prevailed over her heart, and sincerely considered herself that kind of person, until she met Ray. That evening in the bar, the girl didn't notice him at first. Millie, a friend, was hilariously describing an acquaintance, telling such funny stories about him that all of Judith's attention was riveted on her. The friends laughed until they were in tears. Millie was quite the storyteller. Suddenly, Judith felt a light touch on her shoulder from behind. She turned around and met the gaze of beautiful grey eyes. In them, she read admiration, interest, hope. It was Ray. Of course, Judith didn't know his name yet. He was tall, grey-eyed, stylishly and tastefully dressed. Athletic figure, charming, slightly confused smile, refined facial features. Such a man could easily star in a movie. "Good evening," said the young man, slightly embarrassed. It looked rather endearing. "This is for you," he added, handing Judith a rose, a bright red flower in a cellophane wrapping. Where did he get it? Judith wondered. Later, Judith would learn that Ray had been observing her for a long time before approaching. He liked her more and more. Eventually, the young man had dashed out of the bar, walked to the embankment, and bought a flower from a street vendor. At such a late hour, all the flower shops were closed, so he had to walk a considerable distance there and back. He had also hurried, afraid that during his absence the beautiful stranger might vanish. It was a small feat, in the name of a beautiful lady. Judith could hardly believe that such a handsome man had paid attention to her. She knew she was attractive, but the bar was full of girls much prettier than her. Yet Ray had approached her, and with this flower, obtained with such difficulty. They left the bar that evening together. Vigilant Millie asked Judith to call when she got home. That was her way of looking out for her friend. Judith smiled. It felt nice to know someone cared about her, and now she had not only a friend, but also a potential boyfriend. So handsome, striking, gallant. It was a wonderful evening. They walked around the city until morning, getting acquainted, talking, laughing. It turned out that Ray wasn't much older than Judith, but already owned his own business, an auto parts store. Later, Judith would learn that Ray had received the store as a gift from his uncle, who also supervised his nephew, helping him stay afloat. But that night, Judith somehow decided that Ray had achieved everything on his own. Perhaps she just wanted to believe so. It was the final harmonious touch to his image of a prince on a white horse. Ray showered Judith with compliments. The girl had never heard such words addressed to her. It made her dizzy. "You're a gorgeous girl. I was admiring you all evening, but I didn't immediately dare to approach," said Ray, gently squeezing the girl's hand. "I was afraid you might reject me, and your friends intimidated me, but then I realized I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't want to miss my chance." More eloquent than Ray's words were his eyes. He looked at Judith in such a way that she felt like the most beautiful girl in the world. Unique, one of a kind, the best. Judith had never felt so desired. It seemed that her presence made Ray happy. She felt goosebumps on her back. Of course, Judith allowed the guy to walk her home, and she didn't mind when he asked to stay until morning. Soon, they were living together in Judith's rented apartment. Ray had moved in from his parents' home. They were blissfully happy. Judith finally cared for someone and felt cared for in return. Everything was just as she had dreamed. Ray earned well and often gave gifts to his beloved. He enjoyed ordering food from restaurants or taking Judith to cafes. He adored surprises, a festive sort of man who constantly gave Judith presents, both for special occasions and without reason. Once he presented her with a set of turquoise earrings and a matching bracelet, saying the colour reminded him of her eyes. Naturally, this delighted Judith. She had never felt so needed and loved. Ray had his shortcomings, of course. He never cleaned up after himself or cooked. Washing floors, cleaning the kitchen, doing laundry, and organising their days fell to Judith. Now she had to care not only for herself but for Ray too. But he was a man, after all. Household chores were a woman's responsibility, she thought. Ray provided for them, worked hard, and brought colour to their routine, making life brighter and more interesting. That was important too. Most importantly, Ray loved Judith as perhaps no one would ever love her again. He often expressed it directly, unafraid like many men, professing his love daily, giving gifts, gazing at her adoringly, and arranging surprises. Then suddenly came the pregnancy. Judith hadn't intended to become a mother so soon. She had been thinking about enrolling in medical school, but this happened unexpectedly. When Ray learned the news, he rejoiced, hugging Judith and spinning her around the room. "This is wonderful," he exclaimed, his eyes shining. "Just think, we're having a child. I'll walk with the stroller. I'll be a wonderful father and a great example to our son." "Son? We don't know who we're having yet," Judith replied. "Of course, a son. First we'll have a son, then another, and the third will be a daughter." Judith smiled. With Ray, all her doubts vanished. She, too, was now happy about the pregnancy, though initially the news had frightened her and raised many questions. What about her admission to the medical school? What about studying there? "Family and children are what matter most," Ray stated authoritatively. "Your studies? What are they for? You already earn good money as a nurse. And studying, well, imagine how much time and effort it would take. Do you need that? We're at the age where it's time to have children and build a family." Judith found herself agreeing. She wanted to agree. She even felt relieved. Now there was no need to think about enrollment or combining work with demanding studies. She could enjoy waiting for the baby and the closeness of her beloved. Ray and Judith married. The wedding was modest, just the young couple and the groom's parents at a restaurant. Judith's father and stepmother didn't attend. They had to accompany Paul to his next hockey competition. Of course, her parents couldn't miss such a grand event. Well, it was expected and didn't even hurt, because she had Ray, and with him nothing was frightening. Judith trusted Ray completely. They moved into a new apartment, large, bright, in a prestigious neighbourhood. Another of Judith's dreams came true. Ray had inherited this apartment from his grandmother. His parents hadn't allowed him to live there independently until he married. Now that Ray was a husband with his own family, he had grown up enough to move into a separate apartment. It needed repairs, though, and Judith found the funds for that. It was her savings, money she had collected for her upcoming studies. But plans had changed significantly. Now her studies were postponed indefinitely, and the baby was on the way. She wanted to bring the child home from the maternity ward to a beautiful, fully prepared apartment. "You're such a clever girl for saving money," Ray admired. "I'm having big problems with the store now. The profit is small, everything goes into turnover. You're the saviour of our family. Now we'll do such a renovation." Judith was genuinely happy and even proud that she could contribute to setting up their family nest. Of course, she was used to having savings for a rainy day, and now this money was spent. But she felt calm and confident because Ray was around. He loved her and their unborn baby so much. Ray was strong and reliable. He would take care of them. Then Connor was born. When Judith held the baby for the first time, she experienced a rush of feelings stronger than she had ever known. Her father congratulated her rather dryly over the phone. Jacqueline only conveyed her congratulations through him. Neither seemed interested in little Connor. Well, of course, Paul had entered university, and not just any university, but the one in the capital, the pride of the family. Judith imagined how much money his parents spent on his education. They weren't interested in Judith's life. She had given birth, nothing special, and the new mother didn't count on their support. And then there was Ray. His reaction to the baby puzzled Judith. At the hospital discharge, the young man behaved perfectly, looking at the baby tenderly, taking pictures with the tiny bundle, showering his wife with flowers. But at home, Ray rarely approached the child. The baby seemed to cause him either fear or disgust. The infant's cries only irritated the young father. It was evident from the expression on his face. Judith was saddened by this attitude. She wanted her husband to share her enthusiasm about the baby. Judith tried to tell her husband about their son's achievements. He smiled, turned over, sat up, grew his first tooth. Ray always listened with half an ear. Since the birth of his son, he began to appear at home less often, citing work as an issue. Judith soon realized that her husband was spending time with friends in bars and clubs. Ray returned home late, smelling of cigarettes and other people's perfume, sometimes without even removing the nightclub's wristband. It was obvious what was happening. The most hurtful thing was that Ray now looked at Judith differently, as if through her. There was no more interest, no more admiration. Judith realized that she irritated her husband, and it pained her. She knew that childbirth and motherhood had changed her. Sleep deprivation, poor diet, hormones, constant fatigue. Her hair had lost its luster, and she'd gained extra pounds. But it was only temporary. After all, this was a small price to pay for the joy of parenthood. Why couldn't Ray understand this? Judith hoped everything would change when Connor grew up. Sons and fathers typically become close, sharing common interests, experiences, and male friendship. Yet as Connor grew, Ray remained indifferent to him, despite Judith's efforts to involve her husband in childcare and bonding. "I'm tired, I've worked all day," Ray would protest when asked to take Connor for a walk. "I want to watch TV in peace. And you're pushing me out with him. You're home all day. Can't you walk your son by yourself?" Judith could only sigh. Of course, she could walk with the child. She even enjoyed it. But she desperately wanted their son to bring Ray the same joy. It seemed Ray had expected something else from fatherhood and family life. He looked very disappointed. Connor grew up and started kindergarten. Judith returned to work, which made her incredibly happy. But it soon became clear that she couldn't keep her old job. Their son frequently fell ill, requiring her to take sick leave, which wasn't welcomed at the private clinic. Ray could have helped. He had his own business and was his own boss. He could have spared time to come home for a couple of days. But he didn't want to get involved. "Childcare is a woman's job, and the man is the provider. It's not my business to wipe the baby's nose." Judith had to quit her job at a private clinic and work as a nurse at the state hospital. The schedule was more flexible, and the management was more loyal. The salary was significantly less, but Judith tried to view this as a temporary setback. She no longer dreamed of becoming a doctor. Family life had turned out to be much more complicated than she'd imagined. Childcare and household worries all fell on Judith's shoulders only. Ray worked and earned well, but that was all his contribution to the family. His life changed little after their son's birth. He still met with friends and even went away with his buddies for days at a time, flying to the seaside or going hiking. Ray grew more and more distant. Judith became a stranger to him, boring him with her endless domestic issues and problems. He paid little attention to Connor. The boy still bothered him. Judith kept hoping to see some paternal feelings in her spouse, but in vain. Perhaps it was too early for him to become a father. He saw himself as anything but a parent to a little boy, or a model family man, a cool businessman, a young partygoer, a great friend. Household responsibilities depressed and burdened him. Ray didn't even try to hide it. When Connor was 5, Judith's father passed away. They had grown distant in recent years, becoming almost strangers, but Judith still felt a sharp longing for her father. She had held on to hope that someday she and her father would become close again, as they were in her early childhood. Perhaps later, when Paul grew up and left the nest. Now all these dreams had come to an end. Judith cried for her father and for the relationship that could have been rekindled in the future. Ray showed himself quite well during this time. He tried to support his wife, comforted her, and not mincing words, reminded her of what her father had done to his own daughter when he married Jacqueline. A few months later, when it came to dividing the inheritance, an unpleasant surprise emerged. Somehow, Jacqueline had managed to ensure that the apartment remained with her and her son. This was a blow for Judith. She had been counting on at least a partial claim to the living space, and now she found herself without any stake in it. At least Judith had settled down with her own family. She, Ray and Connor lived in a spacious, comfortable, bright apartment with beautiful renovations. They had a roof over their heads, which probably soothed her stepmother's conscience. Judith could easily imagine Jacqueline saying to a friend, "I put so much effort into this apartment. I took care of my husband, gave birth to a son. I have the right to remain the sole owner here. And Judith, that flighty girl, got a good job and married well. But she forgot about her father, never set foot here. So, tell me, does she have the slightest right to claim this apartment? Has she invested a penny in it?" All right. Judith resigned herself to this situation. She cried, exhaled, endured Ray's dissatisfaction with the outcome, and moved on with her life. Judith had enough problems without Jacqueline. Her work was physically exhausting and not well paid. Connor was constantly sick, forcing her to ingratiate herself with her bosses every time she needed sick leave. And, most importantly, her relationship with Ray grew increasingly strained. Judith tried desperately to rekindle Ray's feelings. She took care of herself, went to the gym, updated her wardrobe, and read numerous articles on family psychology. She attempted to engage Ray in interesting conversations and planned activities for them both. All in vain. He had become unreachable, distant, cold, and indifferent. It seemed Ray was content with the mere presence of a family, a submissive wife who managed everything, cleaning, cooking, childcare, without causing unnecessary stress. A beautiful, healthy son. From the outside, Ray appeared to be an ideal family man, which helped his business relationships flourish. However, he clearly had no desire to invest in his family, do anything for his wife and son, or pay attention to them. He preferred partying with friends, clubs and restaurants, as if he hadn't had enough of that lifestyle. Judith gradually realized that her husband might never outgrow this phase. Perhaps it was simply who he was. Once, Judith believed Ray's admiring looks and captivating words were reserved only for her, but then she had witnessed how he interacted with female colleagues, looking at each of them as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world. The women were visibly flattered by this attention. Judith attempted numerous sincere, frank conversations with her husband. She thought he would listen. After all, they once understood each other without words. But each attempt ended in an argument. Ray accused her of violating his personal boundaries, of being nerdy and even mercenary. He reminded her that he was the sole provider and that they lived in his apartment. He demanded understanding, freedom, and sympathy. After such conversations, Judith felt worthless and guilty. Ray knew how to be persuasive. Fear gripped Judith as she watched their family life crumble. Either Ray had transformed into an entirely different person, or Judith had finally opened her eyes to see him for who he truly was, an irresponsible, albeit charming, poseur. All of Judith's attempts to salvage the situation only seemed to make things worse. Then something happened that Judith couldn't bear. It was a Friday evening when she rushed to the store after work, needing to buy groceries before picking up their child from kindergarten. The refrigerator at home was empty, and cooking awaited her. Her mind raced with dinner ideas as she hurried through the shopping centre to the grocery department. The store windows reflected a woman worn down by life, greyish skin, an unkempt bun, baggy clothes meant to hide stubborn extra pounds. Judith disliked her reflection, but clung to hope that things would change, that life would become easier, better, more pleasant. Their son was growing up. Soon, she'd have more time for herself. Occasionally, Judith noticed couples in love, young girls dressed up carefully for their dates, boys with loving eyes and tender embraces. Once, people had looked at her and Ray that way, perhaps even admired them. They had been a beautiful couple, but that seems so long ago now. Suddenly, on the first floor, a familiar shirt caught her eye, a delicate peach shade, her husband's favourite. Judith looked closer and couldn't suppress a gasp. There was Ray, wearing that very shirt, passionately embracing a tall, slender blonde by the waist. The woman laughed merrily, clinging to him. Ray gazed at her with his trademark adoring look, occasionally brushing long strands of hair from his beautiful companion's face with a tender gesture. Judith observed the couple from the second floor for a while. Unaware of her presence, they behaved freely. Ray held the blonde closer and closer until they disappeared into an expensive Italian restaurant within the shopping centre. Judith had seen enough. She sank helplessly onto a bench near the escalator. So, Ray is cheating on her. Though Judith had harboured suspicions before, she had always dismissed them, convincing herself that her husband was simply spending time with his male friends. She had even managed to accept the idea that men needed such companionship, like air. But this blonde, she was definitely not Ray's friend. Their intimacy was evident in the gestures and glances. That evening, after their son Connor had fallen asleep, Judith decided to confront Ray. She deliberated for a long time, but realized she needed clarity and truth, no matter how painful. Ray didn't even try to deny it. He listened calmly as Judith spoke, her voice trembling, her legs unsteady. She must have looked pitiful, for her spouse regarded her with contempt. "Well, that's great," Ray finally said when Judith fell silent. "You figured it out yourself, saving me the trouble of explaining. Yes, I have another woman. I'm in love with her beyond words. And you know what? Before you start protesting, let me say this. Everyone has the right to love. You can't control your feelings, can you? We're never each other's property." Judith sank slowly onto the sofa. His self-assurance and apparent sense of righteousness stunned her. There wasn't a shadow of embarrassment or guilt in his demeanour. Ray spoke at length that evening, presenting Judith with a fait accompli. Yes, I have a woman I love. Beautiful, interesting, fun, unburdened by everyday life. With her, I can discuss more than just bills and children. She's ready to listen to her man. I love her, truly love her. We plan to live together in this very apartment. The move will happen within the month, and we'll divorce because she's expecting my baby. We need to settle this quickly. But what about us? Judith stammered, confused. Her head spun with this new information. Not only did Ray have a mistress, but she was pregnant and planning to move into this apartment. The apartment where Judith had invested all her savings in renovations. The apartment she had considered her own. Connor was born and raised here. He adored his room. How can this be? Ray shrugged his shoulders. You're not the first nor the last to divorce her husband. You have a job. You'll rent an apartment. An alimony? I'll pay for Connor, of course. Alimony. Judith knew that her spouse officially reported the minimum income. Alimony from such an income would be pennies. And Judith couldn't work normally, having to constantly take sick leave. Ray knew this well. But I'm not kicking you out right now, Ray concluded. I'm not such a monster as you try to make me look. You'll find an apartment. I'll help you with the move. Everything will be fine. Well, maybe he would be fine. But Judith foresaw a hard life for herself. She couldn't imagine how she would cope with it all. The outlook in her head was very bleak. Judith felt so alone, so weak and helpless. And no one needed her again. Only now she wasn't responsible for herself. She was with Connor, and Judith felt she was a terrible mother. Good parents can provide their children with everything they need. But what could she, Judith, do? The woman began to look for a suitable apartment. However, nothing worked out for her, not with her salary. Ray now rarely appeared at home, living openly with his mistress, sometimes calling Judith, hurriedly inquiring about the progress of her search for a new home. And Judith had nothing to please him. In despair, the woman decided to resort to an extreme option. The day before, a very unusual story had happened to her. The woman worked as a nurse in the regional hospital, where patients from villages were brought, and in the cardiology department lay an old woman, dry, grey, wrinkled, with very kind light blue, almost faded eyes. Judith felt sorry for this woman. Mrs. Hutchinson was an ideal patient. She didn't complain much, was friendly with the staff, and obediently followed all her appointments. She was already in her 9th decade, and of course the elderly woman had significant heart problems. Everything indicated that she didn't have long to live. No one visited the elderly woman, while other patients were visited by their relatives. Judith felt sorry for her. She would give her something to eat, or talk to her. It wasn't especially pleasant and valuable for a lonely old person to communicate with her. Judith soon learned that Mrs. Hutchinson had once had a large family, a daughter and 2 sons, and a beloved husband, and then fate began to strike one blow after another. First, her husband passed away. He wasn't old yet, but that's how it happened. The man didn't take care of his health and worked hard. Then disaster struck their eldest son, who had chosen the military profession and knew the risks he was taking. Later, his brother died, drowned. The daughter married a foreigner and left. At first she called to ask how her mother was doing. Then she forgot her family altogether. Mrs. Hutchinson guessed she had a good life there, so she didn't want to think about the past. Mrs. Hutchinson was happy for her and took no offence. And so it came to pass that there was a large family, 3 children, and now there is no one around. Mrs. Hutchinson shook her head sadly as she told Judith her tragic story. Judith looked at the elderly patient now with entirely different eyes. How can a person survive so much grief? Judith often talked to Mrs. Hutchinson. Soon, the elderly woman knew a lot about the young nurse. She knew that Judith had grown up without a mother, that her evil stepmother had left her without an apartment, and she knew about her problems with her husband. And of course, Judith told her favourite patient about her dream, the unfulfilled dream of becoming a doctor. "I have lived in this world for many years," Mrs. Hutchinson said when Judith first told her what she wanted to become. "And I know one thing. If you want something terribly, it will definitely come true. I don't know how it works, but I'm telling you for sure it will come true, and that's it." And then, one day, Judith came in for her shift and was surprised to see that Mrs. Hutchinson's bed was empty. The nurse said that the elderly woman had passed away during the night. Judith felt a pain, an emptiness in her heart, as if she had lost a loved one. And so it was, for Mrs. Hutchinson was the only one who had listened to her so attentively and with such interest. She pitied and sympathized with Judith, and even managed to find encouraging words. A little later, a surprising thing came to light. It turned out that Mrs. Hutchinson had left Judith her cottage in the village and had written a will for the nurse. "Wow, this is unexpected," Judith shared her impressions with her colleagues. "What's so unexpected?" asked Kate, a young doctor. "She has no one at all, and here you are. The old woman was pleased that someone was listening to her. The elderly need a lot of attention. You brightened up her last days, and she thanked you. You can't take your old house to the next world anyway, and the old lady understood that. Lucky you." "Lucky indeed," Diana, the head nurse, grinned. "What will Judith do with this junk in the middle of nowhere? The house of such an old lady, it's a wreck, definitely. I wouldn't even look at it. Drive 2 hours to this village to look at a blackened, shriveled shed? No thanks. I've got better things to do." The others shared Diana's opinion. They all agreed that the inheritance was not worth a penny, and Judith thought so too, of course. She had almost forgotten that she owned the village house, but considering the new circumstances, she had to remember. Judith took out a leaf from the folder with the documents that Mrs. Hutchinson had attached to the will. The old woman's last message, a yellowed piece of paper from her school notebook. "You're a good person, Judith, only very defenseless. You have no one but your little son, and that's how you and I are alike, both lonely. You need help, support. Let my little house be that help. I don't know if you'll ever need my hut. If times get tough, go to the country. It's a shabby little house, but you can live there, and there are good people around, neighbours. They won't let you go to waste. And the view from the window, you'll understand what I mean when you see it for yourself. It's important. The view. Remember, you'll understand. And Judith, girl, don't leave your dream. Follow it. It will give you strength. You have chosen the right path, and you have enough strength. You can do it." Much of the letter was incomprehensible and strange, but Judith knew Mrs. Hutchinson had written it while in a grave condition. Naturally, her thoughts were muddled. Yet, even in her final moments, the old woman was thinking of Judith, trying to do something good for her. That meant a great deal. The following weekend, Judith packed a backpack with provisions and, along with Connor, headed to the station. After a 2-hour train ride, the woman and boy disembarked at a station overgrown with tall grass and bushes. The place looked rather neglected, but oddly cosy. Then they waited half an hour at the bus stop. A dusty, rattling bus dropped the city passengers near the village where Judith's newly inherited house was located. Judith had decided to inspect her property finally. What if the house was still habitable? Even so, the question of moving remained unclear. She needed to determine if work was available in the village or nearby. Only if everything turned out well, which Judith truthfully barely hoped for, would she and Connor move and make a new life. Judith liked the village itself: wide, clean streets, neat houses, and an indescribable scent in the air. She breathed easily and freely here, unlike in the city. There stood her new house. Old, certainly, but charming in appearance. The overgrown garden was unsurprising. Its owner had spent a long time in the hospital, though she had evidently loved it dearly before. Flowers, benches, and even garden gnomes peeked out from the overgrowth. Inside, the house was small. Old furniture, tablecloths, and lace doilies adorned every surface. Mrs. Hutchinson must have valued cleanliness and coziness. Remembering the elderly woman, Judith smiled. She had been a bright soul, and that's why her house exuded such positive energy. It felt cozy and peaceful. Judith liked the house and would gladly stay, but securing work was crucial. She and Connor needed to live on something, and Ray, well, help from him was unlikely. The view from the window. Mrs. Hutchinson had mentioned a wonderful view in her note. Judith checked all the windows, garden, neighbours' fences, nothing special, until she reached the far bedroom. Then she understood what the elderly woman meant. That window looked directly onto a house with a Red Cross sign. A hospital? Or rather, a paramedic office. Of course, perhaps Judith could find work just a stone's throw from home. And what perfect work it would be! Leaving Connor in the house with strict instructions not to go out, Judith went to the neighbouring building. Now to find out if they need workers, she thought. Judith knew villages often lacked medical personnel, as most preferred big cities. Judith knocked cautiously. A scowling man of about 35 with a beard and a white coat appeared. "Ah, you're not from round here," he said. "Locals don't knock, they just come in. Well, come on in." Judith entered. It was an ordinary room converted into a medical office. A couch covered with oilcloth by the window, a table piled with medical documents, and a cabinet with gleaming instruments and vials behind glass doors. "Have a seat," the man said, studying Judith. "What's troubling you?" "Oh, no," Judith smiled. "It's not that. I just—" And she briefly outlined her situation. She told him about Mrs. Hutchinson, her inheritance, and explained her need for work. "I have extensive experience as a nurse. I'm competent in all nursing duties, not afraid of hard work, and skilled in patient communication." "I'm sure you are." The man smiled for the first time, his eyes warming. "If you couldn't talk to patients, Mrs. Hutchinson wouldn't have left you her house. She could see right through people." "So, do you need staff?" "We certainly do. Desperately. I'm the only one in the whole village and area. I can't manage alone. I'm fighting to open an official paramedic station here, but they keep replying that it's not allowed. There's not enough staff, and so on." "And this?" Judith looked around. "Isn't this the medical centre?" "This? I founded it voluntarily. We're operating on a small scale. I'm working alone, but I can't hire help. What doctor would agree to work in the middle of nowhere for a pittance?" "Well, I would, for example." "I can't offer you a decent salary like in the city, though. I'd like to," the man in the white coat warned. "Yes, I understand. As long as there's enough for bread." "Well, there's certainly enough for that. So, what do you say?" "Yes," Judith nodded with a smile. "And I suppose it's time we properly introduced ourselves." The man introduced himself as Brandon. He explained that he had once worked as a doctor in the city, but decided to return to his native village. He'd grown weary of urban bustle and felt drawn to his small homeland, especially since people here needed his help. The nearest clinic was in the district centre, an hour away. Every day brought new medical issues, so Brandon helped his neighbours on literally voluntary basis. Brandon had converted half of the house into a makeshift paramedic's office, living alone in the other half. Judith didn't ask where the money came from, but Brandon understood her unspoken curiosity. As a former highly paid surgeon, he had savings to buy necessary medicine and instruments. The head of community also helped, allocating funds from the budget when possible. The story seemed strange and improbable to Judith, yet she liked Brandon immensely. An aura of calm emanated from him, and his warm gaze betrayed a kind heart. Judith found a job in the village, much to her delight. She briefly returned to the city to pack her belongings. Then she and Connor moved into the house they'd inherited from the kind Mrs. Hutchinson, and a new chapter began for them both. Judith soon met her neighbours. Mrs. Hutchinson was right. They were kind and helpful people who immediately accepted the new nurse as one of their own. Judith worked alongside Brandon with enthusiasm, dressing wounds, setting sprains, and giving injections. Through this work, she quickly became acquainted with the entire village. Brandon praised his new colleague's skill and ability, often saying that she should have become a doctor and finished her studies. "You have good instincts and capable hands," he'd say, shaking his head. "You'd make an excellent doctor." Judith would only shake her head in response. Her long-standing dream now seemed quite unreachable. The villagers loved and respected Brandon, seeking him out not only for medical help, but also for advice. Local men often invited the doctor to join their gatherings, but he invariably declined. He didn't drink at all. He did, however, smoke heavily. Despite his outward sternness and taciturnity, Brandon was a kind and sensitive man. He quickly found common ground with Connor. Brandon adored children in general. His eyes would immediately soften, and a smile would appear on his face at the sight of little ones. The doctor kept candy in his pockets for such encounters, and the village children reciprocated his affection. Although Judith and Brandon worked side by side, she knew almost nothing about his past. He preferred not to discuss himself. The only topic he'd talk about for hours was his ongoing struggle to open a clinic in the village. Brandon waged a relentless battle with officials, appealing to all authorities. He hired lawyers and was constantly involved in lawsuits. These matters often required him to visit town. Judith marvelled at the enthusiasm with which he defended his fellow villagers' rights, and had little doubt that his efforts would eventually bear fruit. One night, Brandon knocked on Judith's window. This was a rare occurrence, signalling that someone in the village urgently needed medical attention, and Brandon couldn't manage alone. She had been asleep for some time, but upon hearing her boss's voice, she immediately woke up and smoothed her hair, not wanting Brandon to see her dishevelled. Judith tried not to admit it to herself, but she was attracted to Brandon. Of course, she never showed her feelings. "I'll get dressed and come," Judith called out to Brandon. "All right, just hurry. It's quite a situation, a real emergency." As soon as she arrived at the office, Judith grasped the situation. On the couch lay Rebecca, writhing in pain and clutching her enormous belly with skinny arms. It was clear labour had started early, and Rebecca was carrying twins. "Did you call an ambulance?" Judith asked, striving to keep her voice steady. There was no need to further frighten Rebecca. "Of course," Brandon replied, "but you know it can take an hour or more for them to reach us, and there's already significant dilation. Rebecca won't wait for them to deliver the babies. Have you ever handled something like this?" "No," Judith said, paling. "Neither have I. I'm actually a neurosurgeon, but we have no choice. We're the only medical professionals here." Brandon had already prepared everything necessary, sterilized instruments, boiled water, and stacked clean towels. It was dangerous, very dangerous. With twins, there was no telling how the delivery would progress, and they couldn't give Rebecca an ultrasound or CTG. They had to proceed almost blindly. The first to be born was a girl. Brandon assisted in the delivery, deftly caught the baby, and handed her to the dazed Judith, who wrapped the newborn in a towel. The girl was tiny, premature, and blue. She didn't cry, a limp body with no signs of life. For the first time in her life, Judith began to resuscitate an infant, a premature one at that. She cleared the baby's mouth of mucus and began to rub the tiny chest to stimulate the lungs. Finally, the baby opened her eyes and gave a weak squeak. Judith exhaled in relief. It was a victory. At that moment, Brandon held the newborn's brother in his arms. He was born much stronger and healthier. The boy immediately announced his arrival with a sonorous cry. Judith smiled. That could only mean one thing. The boy was fine. Brandon tended to the mother while Judith cared for the children. They had done it. Waves of joy washed over Judith. A weight lifted from her shoulders. Everything had gone well. The children were premature but alive and healthy. She and Brandon made an excellent team. Rebecca's husband, mother, and mother-in-law, who had been waiting anxiously outside, entered the office. They stood behind Judith, gazing at the babies with smiles. But something was wrong with Rebecca herself. The relatives didn't suspect anything yet, but Judith could see that Brandon was fussing. Something wasn't right. That's when the ambulance arrived. The paramedics surrounded Rebecca, barely glancing at the babies. They quickly assessed that the newborns were fine, but the mother needed urgent care. "She's bleeding. We're taking her away and we'll send a car for the children. Who from the family will come with us?" Rebecca's mother and husband volunteered. The other grandmother stayed with the babies, as someone had to take them to the hospital. Soon, another ambulance came for the newborns. Brandon briefed the doctors, providing all necessary information. They left, taking the infants and their bewildered grandmother. "Well, that's it," Brandon said. "I think we've made it." "And Rebecca?" "She'll be fine. The ambulance arrived just in time. A little later, and we simply don't have the right equipment here. Rebecca could have died before becoming a mother, leaving those babies orphaned. It's fortunate the twins are okay. Childbirth is a huge risk, and we lack the equipment, drugs, and incubators for premature babies. This case, I believe, will serve as an example for the officials. I'll get my way. There will be a hospital here." He paused, noticing Judith's trembling hands. "What's wrong? Why are you shaking? Everything went well. You're a good girl. You did it." I was so scared," Judith admitted, finally breaking down in tears. The tension had eased, and it was time to release her pent-up emotions. Brandon moved closer and embraced Judith tightly. It was unusual. He had never shown emotions so openly before. The woman immediately felt comforted in his arms, so warm and strong. She found herself wishing he would never let go. Somehow, without Judith realizing how, Brandon kissed her. She responded eagerly, having secretly longed for this moment, though she had hidden her feelings even from herself. Brandon had never shown any particular interest in her before. He generally kept his distance, though his kindness and sensitivity were always apparent. This sudden kiss caught her by surprise. Perhaps the stressful situation had caused them both to drop their guards and stop holding back. They were both delighted to discover their mutual feelings. "I'm sorry," Brandon said, embarrassed. "Sorry?" Judith questioned. "Are you serious?" She pressed herself even closer to him, savouring the warmth of his body. It felt wonderful to feel his heartbeat and inhale his scent. "I didn't just leave the city for the countryside," Brandon finally confessed. "I have my own story. I think it's time for you to know it. I don't want there to be any secrets between us." Brandon was a young but already talented and sought-after neurosurgeon. People from all over the country would sign up for his treatment, patiently waiting their turn. Sometimes Brandon performed what seemed like miracles. His colleagues and journalists praised his operations. A large house, an expensive car, a substantial bank account. The work of a talented neurosurgeon paid well. Everything in Brandon's life seemed perfect, except for his personal life, which was non-existent. This wasn't surprising. The man worked tirelessly and devoted himself entirely to surgery. There simply wasn't room in his world for a relationship. Until now. Then Brandon fell in love, possibly for the first time in his life, overwhelmed by his feelings. The object of his affection was a patient in his own hospital. Samantha was a photo model with stunning looks and huge, expressive blue eyes. She appeared fragile and defenseless. She had been admitted with a head injury. Nothing serious at first glance, but she needed monitoring. The girl had supposedly slipped in the bathroom, fallen, and hit her head on the tiles. It could have ended much worse, but luckily it hadn't. Samantha was often visited by her partner, a businessman much older than the young beauty. He treated her as if she were his property. The girl's bright eyes would immediately dim when he appeared. Only Brandon noticed this, probably because Samantha had already captured his heart. He was particularly attentive to her situation, while others saw only a beautiful, successful couple. One day, Samantha and her fiancé got into a heated argument right in her hospital room. He yelled at her, hurling insults. Brandon couldn't stand by any longer. He intervened, earning a hateful glare from the enraged businessman, who was barely able to control himself. "I'll talk to you later," he muttered to a weeping Samantha before storming out. Brandon awkwardly tried to comfort the girl. His heart ached for her. He wanted to embrace her, but hesitated, unsure of how Samantha would react. The girl herself pressed against the doctor, sobbing and shuddering. Brandon put his arms around her, whispering soothing words. "It was him," Samantha suddenly confessed. "He hit me that night. I didn't fall. He ordered me to keep quiet. I'm afraid of him. He'll kill me sooner or later. I don't want to go back to him." Brandon had saved Samantha then, but at a great cost. He faced threats and was twice ambushed and beaten outside his home. He was summoned to the police department multiple times. Samantha's fiancé reported Brandon to his superiors, accusing him of an inappropriate relationship with a patient. But Brandon didn't care about any of this. What mattered most was that Samantha was there for him, beloved, hoping for his help, waiting for him. Brandon couldn't let her down. Samantha was now living in her saviour's house. They fell asleep and woke up together, watched movies, took walks, and talked a lot. Brandon fell more and more in love. Samantha charmed him, occupying his thoughts and heart. Then, just when Brandon couldn't imagine his life without her, she simply returned to her businessman because he was wealthier and more successful. It turned out that Samantha was willing to tolerate some inconvenience for the sake of it. Brandon couldn't accept for a long time that she didn't truly love him. His heart was broken. He could no longer live where everything reminded him of her. So he left his job and returned to his native village, to the house from where he had once left for the city to study, work and build a life. His parents were no longer alive, but the house felt like an old friend, or even a relative. Here, Brandon found solace in the familiar walls. He didn't want to return to his old life. He was healing his wounds and coming to his senses. Here were his native places, familiar faces from childhood, silence, calmness, and an entirely different rhythm of life. No one knew Brandon's history. People thought he was simply drawn to his roots. It happens to people with age, they reasoned, though it seemed strange to the neighbours. Well, they figured, the rich have a right to their oddities. Brandon couldn't stay idle for long. He realised there was no place in the village where people could get medical help, so he started his fight. He knew it would be a long battle. After all, it's human nature to get sick and injured, and people needed help now. So he opened an improvised medical centre, using his savings to buy what he could afford. "I settled in here, thinking I would never leave," Brandon said, holding Judith tighter, as if afraid she might disappear. "And here you are, so kind, so good, so frank. You care for people just as much as I do. It's like I found a soulmate." "I feel the same," Judith smiled. Judith slid under the blanket and closed her eyes. "Tomorrow," she thought, "I'll finally get my medical degree. The dream has come true, thanks to Brandon too. We've been together for so long, and we seem to love each other more every day. It's wonderful." By then, Brandon had succeeded in opening a tiny hospital in the village. Rebecca's case with her twins had played into his hands in this struggle. The clinic was housed in a 2-story building of the former pub. It was renovated, equipment was brought in, and medical staff were invited. With a sense of accomplishment, Brandon and Judith returned to the city. Now they were a family. Connor couldn't believe his happiness for a long time, and neither could his mother. Brandon, as he had wanted, went back to work, continuing to perform surgeries, giving people health and a chance for a full life. And Judith, she entered medical school, still determined to realize her dream. Brandon supported her in this endeavor and even helped her prepare for the entrance exams. Very soon, Judith, a certified therapist, will join her husband at the hospital as a specialist and start working. Connor has grown up and assures his parents that he too will follow in their footsteps and become a doctor, though he hasn't yet decided on his specialization. Brandon was proud of his stepson's decision. "We'll have our own dynasty, son," he exclaimed. Judith knew it would turn out this way. Everything was going even better than she had dreamed. Jaima shivered in the biting February wind. Nature started showing the first signs of upcoming spring. The sun peeked out, the puddles formed on the sidewalks, and the street birds seemed to chirp with increased cheerfulness. Jaima was relieved that the harsh winter was over. It was her first winter spent on the streets, long, icy and unfriendly. With the warm weather, the girl dared to venture from her winter refuge to the city. The city offered better chances for finding food. Grocery stores, cafes and restaurants always had recently expired food, leftovers from the previous day that couldn't be served to customers. Jaima, who starved all winter, welcomed these opportunities. She had spent the winter in an abandoned house in the village, which she had stumbled upon in the fall. The overgrown, unattended plot was a clear sign of its ownerless state. It was just what Jaima needed. That early November evening, she had understood the imminent arrival of freezing temperatures and the long, cold winter ahead. She needed shelter, and the house had a functioning furnace, thankfully. Jaima knew how to operate it, a skill she had learned from the Caldwells. She was grateful for at least that. She hunched her shoulders against a sudden chill. Goosebumps prickled her skin. Whether it was the lingering February cold or the memory of the family she had spent 2 years with, she couldn't tell. Perhaps it was a bit of both. Jaima had never met her parents and had no idea about their identities. As a newborn, she was wrapped in a cellophane bag and discarded in a trash can. Today, with surveillance cameras ubiquitous, such an act would likely lead to the perpetrator's arrest. However, the person who abandoned Jema remained unknown despite efforts to find them. Now, at the age of 15, Jema was acutely aware that her biological mother had not wanted her. Perhaps her mother saw her as a mistake, a burden to be quickly discarded. Jema grew up in an orphanage, surrounded by indifferent caregivers and embittered children. Despite the difficulties, she always had a clean bed and food, a fact often emphasized by the adults as a reason for gratitude. Jema accepted this as her normal until she realized that many other children led very different lives. They had parents who loved and protected them, who hugged them goodnight, supported them in tough times, and comforted them when they cried. As Jema matured, she began to have questions how life functioned, and the older children from the orphanage, some of whom had experienced life in a family, primarily satisfied her curiosity. "They are from homes. We are from the orphanage," the tall, skinny Lucy explained. "They have parents, and we were abandoned. That's it." "I wasn't abandoned," little Sam interjected, who had recently arrived at the orphanage. Mostly silent and often in tears, he finally spoke up. "I have loving parents, but they were killed in a car accident. That's why I'm here. They would never have left me." Eventually, Jema discovered her own backstory. One night, the chatty nanny, Mrs. Stultz, walked into the children's room to check if everything is all right, and she found Jema awake, having been startled from a terrible dream, a common occurrence for her at the age of 8 or 9. Upon seeing Mrs. Stultz, scolded, "Why are you up? It's night time." The woman's eyebrows furrowed in annoyance. "I'll go to sleep now," the girl promised. It was better not to argue with Mrs. Stultz, for she possessed a surprisingly heavy hand. "If you wake someone, you'll be punished. Understood?" "Understood," Jema whispered, scolding herself internally for failing to pretend to be asleep earlier. But Mrs. Stultz had already started her tirade. "We look after you, care for you. Your parents didn't want you. They discarded you like trash. And we have to exhaust ourselves for your sake." Yes, Mrs. Stultz disliked children. Why she chose to work in an orphanage despite such contempt was a mystery to Jema. Perhaps no one else would hire the grumpy woman due to her advanced age. Regardless, the fact remained, Mrs. Stultz was not just indifferent to children, she literally harboured hatred against them. Whether this was exclusive to orphans, Jema didn't know. "You are all children of alcoholics and marginalised people," Mrs. Stultz continued. The woman was apparently just venting, speaking into the void. "Nothing good will come out of you. You're destined to be slackers like your relatives. The apple never falls far from the tree. Why do they bother with you at all? Even your mother discarded you. You were lucky to be found in time. The old man couldn't sleep, you see. He went to take out the garbage at 5 a.m, and there you were. If he hadn't found you, it would have been less trouble for everyone." "Are you talking about me?" Jema immediately asked. She wouldn't normally have dared to speak to Mrs. Stultz, but the woman was apparently revealing her past. It was impossible to remain silent. "Who else?" Mrs. Stultz shot Jema a contemptuous look. "Was I really thrown in the trash?" Jema's voice quivered, tears welling in her eyes. She suddenly felt deeply hurt. All the children who didn't know their parents often fantasized about their origins. Jema was no exception. She imagined stories where her mother had to leave her at the orphanage for her own good. She always hoped her mother would come back for her one day, to take her away from this dreadful place. But this revelation hit her heart. "So you don't know?" Mrs. Stultz asked, surprised. "The whole staff knows about it. Hasn't anyone told you before?" Jema shook her head. Mrs. Stultz smiled maliciously. "Well, You should know. The old man found you in a garbage can and brought you here to the orphanage. Your mum must have been an alcoholic. That's how you are, just like the rest of them." Mrs. Stultz relished in Jema's grief. She embellished her story with vivid details, describing the dirty supermarket cellophane bag the man found the newborn in. She explained how they searched for Jema's mother in the neighbourhood and the homeless shelter, but to no avail. "You were diagnosed with so many conditions, we thought you'd end up disabled if you survived at all. Your mother must have drunk and smoked during her pregnancy. That's why no one adopted you when you were young. Too many illnesses. And now you're older. Who would want such a burden?" After Mrs. Stultz left, Jema laid awake and motionless for a long time, mulling over the caregiver's words. Maybe Mrs. Stultz lied. Possibly she was teasing me deliberately to hurt me. The next morning, the girl, having gathered courage, approached one of the educators. She had been working in the orphanage for a long time. Surely she must know her story. But the woman confirmed everything. "Yes, you were indeed found in a garbage can by an elderly man, quite accidentally. He even wanted to take you away afterward. To raise you, like a daughter or granddaughter, rather. But who would give a baby to a lonely old man?" "So it's true." The girl started crying because it was the end of her childhood dreams of suddenly having parents. Lucy, who had already turned 12, came to Jema in the dining room and sat next to her. Lucy, not that they were friends. The girls were too different in age for a full-fledged friendship. But Lucy treated Jema with some warmth. Lucy had once had a younger sister. The girl loved her very much, took care of her, and then someone from the guests of Lucy's mother left an unextinguished cigarette on the table. There was a fire, which killed everyone in the house. Only Lucy managed to escape by some miracle. That's how the girl ended up in an orphanage. Lucy often said that she had no pity for her mother. She drank, did not care about her daughters, took to the house of her many friends and suitors, arranged parties from night until morning. But Lucy really missed her little sister. Likely, Jema reminded Lucy of her sister, and she was the only one at the orphanage who treated Jema warmly. "What's wrong?" Lucy asked. "Did the boys hurt you again? Or did the teacher punish you?" Jema confided in her older friend, who smiled sadly in response. "Well, everyone here has a sad story. You were abandoned in the trash right after you were born, which is surely unpleasant. But Ben's mother sold him to gypsies. And Molly's grandmother tried to sell her. She even put an ad in the newspaper." "But why? Why don't parents want their children?" "I don't know," Lucy shrugged, gently stroking Jema's head. "It happens. I think about it a lot too. But try to imagine. Imagine you never had parents. It's easier that way. It's as if you've always been alone and nobody ever abandoned you." Jema managed to cope with her feelings. What else could she do? Life at the orphanage continued as usual. Early risings, exercises, classes and gym. But suddenly something unexpected happened to Jema. At the age of 12, she was adopted by a family. Jema understood that her chances of adoption were slim. People usually preferred to adopt babies or toddlers, but she was already a teenager. Furthermore, her appearance wasn't commonly favoured. She had bright black eyes, widely set dark eyebrows, swarthy skin, and raven black hair. "Your mum probably got scared looking at you and ran off," Mrs. Stultz used to jest spitefully. "Don't listen to her," Lucy always reassured Jema. "You are incredibly beautiful, a real photo model. I wish I had your eyebrows and eyelashes. Mine are so pale, but you're a real beauty." In short, Jema's chances of finding a family were almost non-existent, and she knew it. And then this happened. "A family want to meet you," the head of the orphanage once told Jema. "They want to adopt a teenager from the orphanage. It's rare. They're interested in you. Be ready tomorrow." Jema was nervous about the upcoming meeting. She had given up hope of finding a family, but suddenly potential parents appeared. She feared they might not like her and was anxious about seeing disappointment in their eyes. The thought of herself finding the prospective parents unpleasant never occurred to her. Jema yearned for guardians who would take care of her, protect her and guide her into adulthood in this daunting, confusing world. She had no knowledge of life outside the orphanage, which made the future seem terrifying. But if she could find a loving and understanding mother and father, then she had nothing to fear. On the morning before the meeting with the potential adopters, Jema woke up early, washed her face, combed her hair and got dressed. With nothing to do, she spent a long time wandering the orphanage corridor. Lucy came to support her. "Everything will be all right," she smiled. "Jema, you're so lucky. I'm already 16. There's no hope left for me. I'm so happy for you." Jema immediately took a liking to Anna and Peter Caldwell. They sat at the table next to the cheerful principal. They appeared kind-hearted, simple, tidy and polite. Anna wore a strict blouse and a long skirt, while Peter was in a fully buttoned shirt and classic trousers. The couple didn't appear very modern, but Jema liked that. They didn't resemble her brightly made-up and flamboyantly dressed teachers. It was a refreshing change. They were modest people, with excellent taste. "And this is our Jema," the principal introduced Jema. "A very good girl, quiet, calm, obedient. We've never had any problems with her." Jema had never heard so many kind words about herself. She liked the way she was being introduced to the Caldwells. "Jema," Peter smiled at the girl. "Do you want to find a family?" "Does she want a family?" "Yes, this is her most cherished wish." Jema struggled to find words to express the depth of her feelings, so she simply nodded in agreement. "That's good," Anna rejoiced, giving the girl a warm smile. "We live outside the city on a large farm with chickens, ducks and geese. We also have more children. You'll have brothers and sisters. You don't mind, do you?" "No, of course not," answered Jema, thinking that if these brothers and sisters treated her like Lucy did, she would be more than happy. The Caldwells engaged in an hour-long conversation with Jema, expressing genuine interest in her likes, dislikes, thoughts, dreams and aspirations. The warmth of their interaction made Jema feel comfortable and needed. They seemed to appreciate her, and their approval made Jema feel as if she were spreading wings. In early April, the Caldwells brought Jema into their home, into her new life. She was immediately taken with everything. They lived in a large wooden house outside the city, complete with a garden, various outbuildings, a garage, a barn, a chicken coop, and a summer kitchen. Jema got her own small and modestly furnished room. Having been used to sharing a bedroom with 15 others, she could barely believe her luck. Instantly, Jema was part of a large family. The new mother, father, 5 brothers and 4 sisters warmly welcomed her, showing her around the house and introducing the myriad of pets that included goats, ducks, chickens, cows, rabbits, 2 dogs and 4 cats. Jema was thrilled. The small collection of hamsters and turtles at the orphanage paled in comparison to the Caldwells' menagerie. Anna, Peter and the other children taught Jema how to care for the animals. The girl felt needed and loved. It was the custom of the family to gather for breakfast, lunch and dinner around the long table in the living room. The girls helped their mother set the table, seated everyone, then prayed and began to eat. Obeying their parents was a rule that Jema abided by without difficulty. She felt loved and cared for in this new home. Every night, Anna would hug Jema, bless her and kiss her forehead, which Jema found comforting. Although Peter was more reserved and stern, he often praised Jema for her quick adaptation and learning. She learned to tend the garden and care for the cattle, tasks she had never been taught in the orphanage, where the children weren't even responsible for washing their own dishes. The children studied at home because their school was far away in a neighbouring village, and the Caldwells lived on a secluded farm. Attending school wasn't practical, so the children had online lessons at scheduled times, not daily. Jema preferred this arrangement as it was less intense than her previous schooling in the orphanage. She had more spare time for walking, interacting with her siblings, and playing with animals. Of course, she had to help Anna with the household chores, but Jema was only happy to do them. After all, it is so nice to be needed by someone, to feel part of the family. In general, she was overjoyed to be in such a wonderful place, and her life seemed to her full of promise. The Caldwells had its rules, which took some getting used to. First, as was mentioned, children were required to obey their parents. Secondly, the family prayed before each meal and at specified times in the morning and evening. Jema quickly learned the prayers, so this wasn't a challenge. The family also had a specific dress code. The girls wore long skirts and modest blouses, which Anna and her older daughters sewed themselves. The female family members kept their hair up in tight braids or simple buns. Loose hair was considered inappropriate. This is exactly how a well-bred girl should look. Peter praised Jema's appearance, not like those promiscuous girls from the city. Jema wasn't as pleased. She used to enjoy wearing her shiny black hair down, thinking she resembled the girls in shampoo commercials. However, she accepted that her new parents knew best and had their best interests at heart. There were no irritable nannies, angry children, grey orphanage walls, or bland food. Her new siblings treated her kindly, and they often played in the yard after chores. It was lovely. The only person missing was Lucy, but Jema was hopeful that Lucy would soon leave the orphanage and they could reunite. She was sure Anna and Peter would allow Lucy to visit her, despite rarely having guests. Jema's optimistic outlook shattered about 2 months after moving in with the Caldwells. Jema was taking out the garbage behind the house when she heard a sound. It was the rapid chime of a bell coming from the garden. Mary, Jema's little sibling, flinched. "The bell is ringing. We must go to the garden. Hayes is about to be punished," she said. Hayes? Jema was surprised. Hayes was one of their older brothers. He had returned from town later than agreed upon the previous day. He periodically went to the market to sell dairy products from their farm. He looked like a grown-up guy, so Peter and Anna let him go alone. After the market, he was permitted to visit his old school friends who lived in town. However, he was obliged to return home by a certain time, and yesterday he was late. Peter shook his head regretfully, and Anna sighed. Hayes looked so unhappy and scared that Jema felt that this was already punishment enough for him. The siblings watched him with sympathy. Jema thought the matter was over, but it wasn't. And now Jema followed Mary into the garden, hopeful that everything might turn out all right. Everyone else was already there. Anna held a bell in her hands. "I wonder where the parents found this rare item," she mused. Peter looked serious, even solemn. Next to him stood a pale, frightened Hayes. Clearly apprehensive, he nevertheless resigned himself to his fate. In Peter's hands was a belt, a thick leather strap with a metal buckle. Jema didn't notice it right away, only later, when the punishment instrument had already gone into action. "A son must obey and honour his parents," Peter declared, surveying his many children. He didn't even glance at the 40 Hayes. "A parent's word is law. Those who stray from their parents' commands will face an unhappy fate. We want all our children to be happy and successful, which is why we cannot tolerate disobedience." "If you spare the rod, you spoil the child," Anna added, looking sympathetically at Hayes. "We love you, son. We cannot let you fall. You must be punished." Hayes sighed heavily and nodded in acceptance. Then something terrible occurred. Peter began to whip Hayes with a belt, targeting his back, legs, and shoulders. With each blow, his hits became increasingly vicious, as if he derived pleasure from it. Jema watched her new father in horror. His eyes glowed with a perverse delight. There were aspects of him that reminded her of Mrs. Stultz, but at least she never resorted to physical violence or masked her anger as care. A robust, tall man was beating a frail, defenseless boy. Hayes' body quickly marked with red, swollen welts. Some even began to bleed. The pain must have been excruciating. "Endure it," whispered Mary, who was standing next to Jema. "Just endure, or he will hurt you even more." Jema felt sick to her stomach, wishing the horrifying scene unfolding before her was just a nightmare. How could Anna and Peter, such kind and virtuous individuals, allow such cruelty? Peter was doing it, and Anna was silently condoning it. And the other children? They observed Hayes's beating with unsettling calmness, showing sympathy for him, but clearly accepting it as normal. Even in the orphanage, things were never this brutal. The staff might spank someone, maybe even pinch them, but that was it. The children had regular medical examinations, and adults were asked for every bruise. But here, Hayes fell down and seemed to lose consciousness for a while. Jema feared that the boy would die now. Peter whipped the teenager a few more times, then suddenly calmed down. "This is a lesson for you and the others," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Go to your room. You'll be locked up for 2 days without food." Anna helped her son up and led him into the house. He was shaky. The others returned to their chores as if nothing had happened. "Let's go," Mary said, pulling the stunned Jema by the arm. "We've got to clean up after the house, right? Did you see what happens for disobedience?" From that moment, fear nestled in Jema's heart. She worried about doing something wrong and ending up like Hayes, standing in the garden awaiting punishment. The mere thought made her heart clench. The Caldwells no longer seemed wise, kind, or understanding to her. They were frightening. What had once seemed nice and pleasant to Jema now appeared in an entirely different light. The children lived like hermits, isolated from people, under the control of 2 oppressive adults. They cared for livestock, worked in the vegetable garden, barely studied, and only interacted with each other. The once safe and kind world created by the Caldwells no longer felt that way to Jema. She began to think that staying in the orphanage would have been better. But there was no turning back now. The Caldwells were unlikely to let her leave. The Caldwells were strict with those who disagreed, were stubborn or slow. Now Jema often saw them punish the children for the smallest offences, like poorly executed tasks. The severity of the punishment matched the offence. Sometimes children were locked in a room without food and water for days, or made to stand in a corner on peas for hours. More serious misconduct led to public floggings in the garden, with a bell summoning everyone to witness the punishment. The discipline was not just limited to the boys. Once, Peter beat his eldest daughter Aisha for simply browsing swimsuits online. Peter and Anna feared their daughter might become a vicious woman, with Peter vowing to prevent that by beating her with a belt. Aisha held back her screams, knowing that would only make Peter angrier. Jema also faced her share of troubles, primarily for arguing with her parents. One day Mary was hungry, but it was a long time until lunch, and her pleas fell on deaf ears. Unable to wait, the little girl took a piece of pie without permission. Anna saw it, and Anna informed her husband about it. Peter accused his youngest daughter of theft and retrieved a belt from the closet. Mary and Jema who were also present in the kitchen at that time, understood its meaning. Mary trembled like a leaf, but dared not cry or beg for mercy. Jema, imagining her father punishing the little girl in front of everyone, felt a cold sweat on her back. Without thinking twice, she stood up for her sister, politely and cautiously asking Peter and Anna to forgive Mary for her minor transgression. As a result, Peter punished both daughters with the belt, Mary for stealing and Jema for disrespecting her parents. Jema felt that their punishment was less severe than that of their older siblings, but she still cried from the pain, the indignity, and the sense of helplessness. Also, Jema often found herself left in the basement without light or food for days on end. This experience was even more dreadful than public floggings. In the pitch-black darkness, she began to fear that she was forgotten, that she may never see the light again. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. During her 2 years at the Caldwell's house, Jema endured various forms of punishment. Floggings, confinement, kneeling on dry peas for an hour, deprivation of food and water. She was forbidden from going to town. Only the older children would occasionally leave the farm to help their parents sell their home-grown produce, meat, dairy products and vegetables. Jema understood that her circumstances were not normal, yet she had no one to confide in. If any of the children became ill, they were cared for by Anna, with no doctor even being called. The children received their education through an online school, watching recorded lessons and submitting projects via email once a quarter. Even this lifeline to the outside world was tightly controlled. Peter would disable the internet after classes, and only he knew the password. This made it impossible for Jema to reach out for help online. The Caldwells ruled unchallenged over their adopted children, who considered their circumstances as normal. Most of these boys and girls had joined the family as infants and knew no other life. Peter and Anna convinced the children that the world beyond their fence was perilous, brutal, vicious and unjust. They asserted that safety could only be found within their farm. However, Jema knew this was untrue. She yearned to escape and reveal the truth to those outside. Peter often visited the village and had friends there, but no one ever visited their home. And it was understandable, as people would have known something was wrong here. Jema was desperate to find an escape route. The fence was tall, smooth, and impenetrable. Trees grew far from it, a placement that seemed deliberate. Scaling the dauntingly high fence seemed impossible. Even if she could find a ladder, someone would surely notice her attempt to escape. There were always family members around, and they kept a close watch on each other. Jema's new siblings truly believed that the world beyond the fence was unjust, vicious, and hostile. They accepted the Caldwells' harsh punishments as normal, oblivious to the damage these cruel individuals inflicted on their lives. If any of them discovered Jema's plan to escape, they would either thwart her attempts or immediately report her to the adults. Despite this, they weren't inherently malicious children. They were kind and modest, treating each other well and offering mutual support. However, the Caldwells have raised them to betray each other without remorse. They've been conditioned to believe that they're helping the offender by reporting their wrongdoings. If one of them saw the other misstep, violated one of the parental prohibitions, this witness would tell the father or mother what happened. They were sure they were doing a good deed and saving a lost soul. Jema had witnessed such incidents many times, each more terrifying than the punishment her foster father's belt could deliver. Once, Jema herself was penalized for not reporting her younger sister. Stacy had accidentally knocked over a bucket left by their eldest sister at the barn's entrance. The milk spilled, startling Stacy. Jema, having witnessed the incident, tried to comfort her. "Don't worry," assured Jema. "No one saw you. If anyone asks, we'll just say the cat did it." Stacy looked at Jema in disbelief, seemingly shocked by her sister's words. However, their plan didn't work out. A couple of hours later, a bell rang in the garden, signalling that punishment was imminent. Peter was going to discipline Stacy for spilling the milk, and Jema was planning to lie to their parents and protect the guilty party. It turned out that Mary had witnessed the incident at the barn. Even the honest and well-meaning child, she immediately reported the event to Peter in good faith. The siblings were convinced that their parents were merely caring for them, that punishment was a form of purification. The Caldwells succeeded in instilling their rules and thoughts into the minds of the adopted children, but Jema was the exception. Perhaps her resistance stemmed from joining the family as a teenager rather than a little child. To survive, Jema played along, trying hard to avoid rousing suspicion, while desperately seeking an opportunity to escape. However, the foster parents were not entirely fooled. They scrutinized Jema more closely than the others, severely limiting her freedom. Jema saw no opportunities to break free or communicate her situation to others. The adults were too cautious to let her outside. Once, they intercepted her paper airplane. In a desperate plea for help, Jema had written a letter, folded it into an airplane, and launched it over the fence. She hoped the makeshift plane could overcome the barrier she couldn't, and that someone would find the note. It worked, but the finder turned out to be Peter himself. Jema was brutally beaten. She thought she was going to be killed. Afterwards, she was thrown into a basement and left there for several days without food or water. She experienced unbearable thirst and painful wounds, while time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Later, she had a long conversation with Peter and Anna. They continued to feed her their pseudo-religious beliefs, intimidating her with tales of hell and hell-fire, assuring her that their only intention was to save her. Jema meekly nodded, thinking to herself that these people must be either criminals or mad. It would be best not to argue with them. Then Peter said something that made Jema shudder. "You now officially have a psychiatric diagnosis," he said, looking straight into Jema's eyes. "It's in your medical records. You've been prescribed potent medication. Delusions and strange fantasies are symptoms of your disease. You can write all the notes you want now. No one will believe you. Nobody." "But how did you do it?" Jema exclaimed in shock. She knew that to receive a diagnosis, one would need to see a doctor. "With Stacy's help," Anna explained. "You're almost the same age and you're very much alike, so she played along for your salvation. We took Stacy to the doctor. She's in the hospital now. When she gets out, you'll be an official psychiatric disability." Peter smiled, looking at the girl's confused face. "We had to do something. Had to keep ourselves safe." Anna waved her hands. "You forced us to go to such measures." Jema grinned. Good cop, bad cop. Classic of the genre. The girl realized she was now officially a mental patient. That means whether she screams or calls for help, no one will believe her. It's a terrible situation, and her chances of breaking free and living a normal life are practically null. But Jema was not going to give up. Staying in the Caldwells' house and living by their rules for many years was not for her. The Caldwells were making far-reaching plans. They wanted to move to the hinterland and join the sect, a community that lived in the forests away from people, survived by subsistence farming, and rejected all the benefits of civilization. For Peter, they were an ideal he aspired to. Jema understood perfectly well that after this move, she wouldn't be able to escape. The whole community would be watching her. Then one day, the real opportunity to escape presented itself to Jema. Peter, while on his way to the town market, had forgotten to lock the door. He had assumed Hayes would do it, but Hayes, engrossed in the workshop, had not heard his father's request. Jema, who was weeding the vegetable garden, saw everything. Mary was with her because, from that point forward, one of the siblings always accompanied her, as ordered by Peter and Anna. They wanted to keep a close eye on his defiant stepdaughter, as they did not trust her, despite her attempts to appear docile and defeated. Upon seeing the ajar door, Jema's heart pounded fiercely. This is my chance to escape. Even though I'm not prepared, my things aren't packed, and I don't have a plan. I must seize this opportunity. Another chance like this may never come again. Slowly, Jema straightened up, dusted off her hands, checked that Peter's car was safely away, and then sprinted towards the open door. Stop! Where are you going? Mary's surprised and thin voice trailed behind her. Jema didn't even turn around. Of course, she knew that her escape would result in consequences for everyone. All the children would be punished for not keeping an eye on her. Mary and Hayes, who failed to close the door in time, would face the harshest punishment. However, Jema couldn't afford to worry about that now. She ran out the gate and surveyed her surroundings. It had been a long time since she had seen such openness. A wide field lay ahead, bisected by a country road, which Peter used to travel to town. Jema was aware of a nearby village where she could seek help. She just had to get there. Knowing Mary would rouse everyone and that her older brothers, who were fast and strong, would pursue her, Jema ran with all her might. Realizing that she couldn't outrun her brothers on the open road, she veered into the cornfield and plunged inside it. From here, she couldn't even see the road, but she was confident she was heading in the right direction. She remembered exactly where to go. Navigating through the dense growth was challenging. Fresh scratches added to the scars and wounds from past punishments. Swarms of insects were a nuisance, buzzing around the fugitive. Despite these discomforts, Jema found this better than being confined within the Caldwell's house. She was finally free, and even felt a noticeable ease in her breathing. The feeling of being outdoors, the freedom to wander wherever her feet led her, and the ability to breathe in deeply was exhilarating, especially after almost 2 years of captivity. She soon approached a village, but hesitated to leave the cover of the corn. She needed to survey the area first. The area appeared serene, with its quiet streets, cosy houses, and low, multicoloured fences that offered glimpses of people, gardens, and vegetable patches. They were ordinary homes, a stark contrast to the Caldwell's impenetrable fortress. However, the girls soon realised that the village was surprisingly bustling. Jema observed people in the streets and groups of adults and teenagers wandering around the outskirts of the village. She wondered if they were searching for her, and soon her suspicions were confirmed when she spotted her brother's bicycle lying in the grass beside the first house in the village. At that moment, she understood the situation. The brothers hastily alerted the villagers about their sister's disappearance, describing her as mentally ill. The entire village was now searching for her. A group of middle-aged women came dangerously close to Jema's hiding place. "We should search the fields and forest," one suggested. "That poor thing, she's probably seeking solitude and silence. Our forest is quiet and peaceful. She's likely hiding there. The men are already searching the woods with dogs," another woman added. "If she's there, they'll find her." "Poor girl," a third woman sighed. "She's so young and already diagnosed. It's only going to get worse. She should be returned to the family. They care for her, they treat her. They're literally holy people." "I would say they are fools," interjected a woman with thin lips and a prickly demeanour. "Why would they adopt children with disabilities from the orphanage? It's a burden for them, and it's not fair to the other children to have to live with such challenges." "You're heartless," another woman disagreed. "Those children are human too. They say this girl suffers from her delusional fantasies and even self-harms. They have to restrain her during episodes." "She belongs in a hospital, in a secure ward with padded walls," insisted the woman with thin lips. It would be better for everyone, including the girl. They're planning on it, the second person said. I overheard that if they catch the girl, they'll admit her to the hospital immediately. She has an official diagnosis, so there will be no argument about her admission. They'll give her medications, provide her with care. She'll come out an entirely different person. The disease won't disappear, of course, but they'll be able to manage her symptoms. The women conversed briefly before departing, leaving Jema alone with her thoughts. She reflected on her predicament in light of their conversation. She realized she couldn't reach out to the villagers for help. They all sided with the Caldwells. Peter had convinced them that he was caring for a mentally unstable daughter. Now that she had run away, they wouldn't believe her if she tried to reveal the truth. To them she was mentally ill, prone to delusions and hallucinations. If she approached them, they would send her back to the Caldwells, who might commit her to a hospital. There, her pleas would fall on deaf ears due to the grim diagnosis in her medical record. Jema had pinned her hopes on her scars, thinking they would serve as evidence of her mistreatment. However, the villagers believed the runaway girl was inclined to self-harm. This too was a dead end. Peter had cleverly manipulated every possible outcome. Jema resolved to head for the town, as it offered her better chance to get help and potentially save the other Caldwell's children. She hoped they might receive assistance from psychologists or psychiatrists who could help them see the true nature of their foster parents. Time was of the essence. She had heard that search parties with dogs would soon scour the area. Jema ran faster than she ever had before. Knowing the direction of the town and hurrying towards it, she didn't stop, even when night fell, seemingly unaffected by fatigue. Fueled by adrenaline, Jema endured a challenging day-long journey, reaching the town by 6 a.m. She was conscious of her dishevelled appearance, a long skirt with a ragged hem, a dirty shirt with messy hair. Fortunately, the streets were deserted at that hour. She needed to find the police station, which would surely offer the help she sought. However, as she was about to take a step forward, she noticed a flyer on a pole that stopped her in her tracks. It was an ordinary A4-sized flyer, but it bore her picture. The text beneath quickly made her realize she couldn't seek help in the town either. The Caldwells had outmaneuvered her, reporting her to the police and even distributing flyers. The text stated that a girl with a psychiatric diagnosis was missing and provided a description matching Jema. The flyer cautioned the public to be wary when encountering the teenager, as her diagnosis could lead to unpredictable behavior. Jema did not go to the police. Instead, she sought refuge in an abandoned part of town and found shelter in a dilapidated house, where she finally fell asleep. Overcome with exhaustion, she fell into a deep sleep almost instantly. When she awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, and her mind was clearer. Sitting up and hugging her knees, Jema leaned against the wall, ready to contemplate her situation. Her prospects were bleak, but she faced the reality with courage. She reasoned, I can't go to the police. They already know about me. I shouldn't go to the orphanage either. They've probably been warned as well. No one will help me now. People know a disturbed girl is missing and are ready for the runaway to start spouting delusions. The Caldwells have thought of everything. They must have anticipated that I would eventually flee and seek help, and have ensured that everyone would consider me unstable. The only option left is to stay on the streets. I can't return to the Caldwells' house, and I have nowhere else to go either. Jema sighed, knowing it would be challenging. If there were no other options, she would have to start a new life. Firstly, she desired to shed her uniform, the drab attire she was obliged to wear at the Caldwells' house. She yearned to appear as a regular teenager, attracting less attention. Jema was aware that people often left bags of usable clothes near trash bins. That's where she sought her new wardrobe, and she found it. After changing into a sweatshirt and baggy jeans, Jema immediately felt more comfortable and decided that her life was going to improve. Initially, Jema joined the street children at the train station. These were boys and girls with complex backgrounds, forced to survive on the streets. They all slept collectively in an old house, curiously located in the city's centre. This district was historical, boasting a beautiful street lined with lanterns, monuments, fountains, and stylish cafes. At all hours, it bustled with well-dressed people, families, stylish youths, loving couples, and elegant seniors. Just a stone's throw away from a row of shops and cafes, hidden behind them was an alleyway. This was home to old crumbling houses and sidewalks overtaken by tall weeds. It served as a haven for the poor and destitute, a home for the homeless. The inhabitants would scatter like cockroaches whenever the police visited. Some were caught, but the agile and swift street kids always managed to escape. Each of these children had complex circumstances. Some were runaways, others fugitives from the law. Their shared trait was a desire to avoid adult intervention. Jema was not fond of the street kids. Though they all lived on the streets, she preferred cleanliness, while her new friends disregarded hygiene and order. They were thieves, and despite their attempts to teach her, Jema could not bring herself to steal. What distressed her most was these children's consumption of alcohol and cigarettes. According to one boy, it was their way of making the world nicer for them. The more time Jaina spent with them, the more she realized this life was not for her. So one day she left without a word. Jema had another plan. She knew winter was approaching and she needed to find a place to spend the colder months. She believed that place could be found in the nearest villages, an area likely filled with abandoned houses. After exploring many properties on a chilly November morning, she finally found what she was looking for, an abandoned wooden house. It seemed almost welcoming, eager for a new inhabitant. The house's interior suggested that an elderly woman had once lived there, with antique furniture, crocheted doilies on all surfaces, and a colourful rug on the floor. It was cosy but needed a thorough cleaning. Jema happily cleaned the single room and small kitchen, sweeping the floors and dusting off surfaces. Then she lit the furnace. Using the abundant firewood from the yard, the house quickly warmed, becoming cosy and inviting. Jema mentally thanked the Caldwells for teaching her how to heat a house, a skill that was proving invaluable. Her life was quiet and routine. The house was a safe haven for her, providing comfort and security. Jema fetched water from the nearest lake for cooking and hygiene, carrying the heavy bucket back to the house. She then boiled the water on the hot furnace to kill any germs. Despite the challenges, the girl found this way of life bearable. Jema found warm clothes at the dump, situated roughly a kilometre from her new shelter. It was fortunate that people frequently left bags filled with items still in good condition at the entrance. The dump was a treasure trove of useful items, such as furniture, toys and books. Jema would occasionally visit, much like one would a store, browsing and selecting items. However, obtaining food was a challenge. Unlike in the city where cafes and restaurants were plentiful, the remote location of the house offered limited options. Jema used to rely on discarded food from city eateries, which often discarded perfectly edible meals. Despite these challenges, Jema had a solution. There were many abandoned houses in the neighbourhood that were easy to get into, and the girl learned to spot such residences. The cellars of such houses were filled with jars of pickles or jam. Some of these jars had been untouched for so long that their lids had turned black. Jema would take a few jars from these cellars. Although it was practically theft, she believed the owners would not notice a few missing jars among their abundant stock. Jema preferred to get food in the city, but the frosty winter days confined her to the house. It was unthinkable to travel to the city in such cold. Jema could stay warm and content in the house, reading children's fairy tales by candlelight in an old, creaky armchair. She found the magical stories fascinating. On such cold days when Jema was confined to her house, She often pondered her future. Would she spend her life alone in an old cottage? She dismissed this thought, knowing that eventually the old lady's heirs would sell it, and she'd have to find a new place. This cycle of uncertainty made her feel bitter. It was tough to be alone and unneeded. Jema missed having someone special in her life. She once had Lucy, but she didn't know where she was now. Would they ever reunite? The realization that no one else cared for her was painful and difficult to accept. However, as the thaw began and the sun emerged, Jema's spirits lifted. She looked forward to her walks and yearned for food other than pickles and jam. One day, after a week of warm weather, Jema took her usual path to the city, admiring the soft blue sky and basking in the gentle sunlight. It was so warm that she unbuttoned her down jacket, a treasure she'd found at the dump during late fall. In the city, everything had worked out perfectly. Many cafes had held weddings and anniversaries the day before, resulting in plenty of leftovers. Jema had 2 full bags, enough to last a long time. She planned to store it outside in the snow, almost like a refrigerator, and it would feed her for a long time. It was splendid. However, an unexpected event occurred. The sky suddenly turned grey, making the atmosphere cold and uncomfortable. What seemed like a beautiful spring day a couple of hours ago had abruptly turned wintry, as a biting wind blew and prickly snow sprinkled from a dark cloud. Jema, in despair, glanced at the sky. She realized it would be very challenging, if not impossible, to get home in this weather. But she had to act, not just stand there and wait for the unknown. Jema hurriedly started her journey towards the city exit. The way was long, and given the weather, it would probably take her until night to reach. She accelerated her pace, almost running, until exhaustion set in outside the city. She then trudged along the bypass road, taking cover behind a wall of stunted, leafless trees. Now she could not move as quickly and crawled forward at a turtle's pace, realizing she might not make it to the cottage. Jema regretted her decision. Why did I leave the city? At least there I could have waited out the bad weather in the shopping centre. I could have stayed in the city for a few days, warming up on the heating duct with my old friends. Yes, it's risky, but choosing to go home was even riskier. Jema was shivering, the cold penetrating to her bones. Her down jacket offered no warmth. Her face burned with frostbite, her eyes watering. She ventured out to the road. Because of the snow and wind, visibility was nearly zero, and darkness was rapidly setting in. But at least cars were passing by, their headlights piercing the gloom. Jema knew she was close to collapsing into the snow, which would quickly bury her, and she would only be found in the real spring when the snow melted. But by then it would be too late. Maybe it's all right after all. Nobody needs me. Nobody will even miss me, she thought. Cars sped by her. Perhaps drivers didn't notice Jema in the glare of their headlights, as she kept a safe distance from the curb. And even if they did, who would care about her? A 3-legged dog limped past. The girl and the dog glanced at each other and continued on their separate paths. They both realized that they were probably doomed. Suddenly, Jema heard the screech of brakes. She halted and turned around. An SUV had pulled up by the curb. The driver, a tall, handsome man who seemed straight out of a movie, jumped out, leaving the door open. He was dressed in a coat, stylish sneakers and jeans. He was hatless, which made sense given the warmth inside the car. The man ran after a dog. He must have noticed the limping animal by the roadside and decided to help. From there, Jema acted on autopilot. She turned and sprinted towards the car, seeking refuge from the cold. The inviting warmth was within reach. While the man was busy attending to the dog, Jema swiftly slipped into the back seat. The interior was welcoming with soft seats, a faint citrus aroma, a soothing melody playing, and most importantly, it was warm. The comforting environment made her cheeks and arms tingle and her head spin slightly. Jema watched the man petting the dog on the curb. The animal wagged its tail in response, reminding her that even animals need care and attention. Suddenly, something caught Jema's eye. She turned and gasped. There was a child's seat with a small passenger, a little girl, in it. The semi-darkness in the cabin had initially hidden the child from her. Jema was startled, wondering how the child must feel seeing a stranger entering the car. Jema had no intention of scaring the little girl, and it seemed she hadn't. The child remained in her seat, presumably asleep. The young passenger was garbed like a princess, in a white rhinestone-embroidered jumpsuit with a fur-lined hood, silver Uggs, and a hat featuring a large white pom-pom. 2 blonde pigtails peeked out from beneath the hat. Jema examined her more closely and gasped in shock. The child's face was inanimate. Her chubby cheeks, rosy lips, and glassy blue eyes stared into the distance, devoid of human warmth. Jema's heart started hammering against her ribs at breakneck speed. In the child's car seat sat not a child, but a doll, a large doll, as tall as a real child, dressed in fancy attire. Why would anyone do this? The car's owner must be insane, she thought. Despite her reluctance to linger in the plush interior of the beautiful car, Jema knew she should leave. But it was too late. The man was already returning to the SUV, cradling an old dog carefully in his arms. There was no way the girl could slip past him unnoticed. And this man, he must be a terrifying person. It wasn't normal to transport a doll like this, was it? The man opened the back door to settle the dog on the seat. His gaze met Jema's eyes, filled with terror and despair, and the girl leapt out the opposite door and dashed into the field, sinking knee-deep into the snow. However, the man pursued her. He caught up with her swiftly, seized her arm, and spun her around. He's going to hit me, Jema thought, struggling to break free. But escape was impossible. The man's grip was unyielding. I didn't take anything from you, Jema protested. I'm not like that. I'm just homeless. I want only to warm up. Please let me go. Wait, the man stopped her. How did you end up here? It's far from the city, even further from the nearest village. Where are you from? I'm homeless. I live in an abandoned house in the village. Homeless? The man's eyebrows shot up in surprise. What's your name? Jema, the girl answered honestly. The man seemed normal, even safe. However, she had seen that terrifying doll in his parlour. Jema, it seems like you're in trouble. Teenagers shouldn't live alone like this. And it's a long way to the country estate. You won't make it. You'll freeze on the way. Can I at least give you a ride? Jema shook her head, thinking, Stay in the car with that horrible doll. No way. I see. The man sighed. You saw the doll and got scared, is that right? Jema nodded. Well, it does look creepy, I agree. But it's just a doll. It has its own unique story. There's no need to be scared of it. Let's get in the car quickly. You're already freezing. Jema looked at the man with fear. She desperately wanted to return to the warmth. But what kind of man was he? A normal adult wouldn't carry a terrifying toy like a real child in a car seat. The man noticed the girl's puzzled expression, sighed heavily and said, I'll tell you about the doll on the way. It's not easy, but otherwise you'll stay here and freeze to death out here. Jema, now intrigued, focused on the man. She was eager to hear the story. By the way, I haven't introduced myself yet, the man added with a smile. My name is Jeff. You can call me that. Jema nodded in response. She looked at Jeff, waiting. She was eager to unravel the mystery of the doll and perhaps return to the warmth of the car afterward. unaffected by the cold wind and snow covering them, Jeff began his tale. Both of them were engrossed by the story. It captivated them completely. Since childhood, Jeff was in love with his classmate, Helen. However, she, drawn to bolder, more reckless boys, overlooked him. Despite his feelings, Jeff was unsure of how to act. This dynamic shifted when they encountered each other at university. A chance meeting led to frequent conversations, and they soon became inseparable. Helen began to see Jeff in a new light, realizing how wonderful he truly was. Jeff finally confessed his long-held feelings to Helen, and they eventually married as students. They decided to postpone parenthood until they were financially stable and had established their careers. Years later, Helen and Jeff felt ready to start a family and welcomed a beautiful daughter. Alice was a loving and obedient child who made every effort to please her parents. The family travelled extensively. Jeff and Helen were eager to teach Alice about the world while learning alongside her. Helen did not return to work until her daughter started first grade. She spent those early years focused on her child's development, enrolling her in various activities like language lessons and choreography. Helen wanted her daughter to be well-rounded. However, as Alice grew older and became more independent, Helen decided it was time to end her 7-year maternity leave. Alice was self-reliant and responsible enough to stay home alone. The girl used to come home from school by herself, do her homework, and sometimes even cook dinner for her parents. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. However, things changed when a busy road was constructed near Alice's school. It became dangerous to walk there. Drivers tried to fly quickly through the intersection. There were not enough traffic lights and crosswalks yet. Helen now often left work early to get her daughter home, fearing her daughter might get hit by a car. One day, Helen couldn't get permission from her boss to leave work early. Alice had come home by herself before and would always let her mother know when she had arrived safely. But on this day, Alice didn't send a message and didn't answer her phone. Worried, Helen left work and went home, only to find that Alice hadn't returned. Helen and her husband rushed to the school, where they learned that Alice had left as soon as school ended. They spoke to Alice's friends, who said they had parted way at the usual spot near the store. From there, Alice's whereabouts were unknown. Helen and Jeff rushed to the police. A statement was taken and the search for their child began immediately, with volunteers joining in. For 3 long, agonizing days, they were left in the dark, unable to find rest or eat. Tragically, one of the volunteers found Alice's lifeless body hidden in the basement of an old house in a disadvantaged neighborhood. The person responsible for this atrocity was never found. Although the search for the perpetrator continued, for Helen and Jeff, life came to a halt. Time passed, Jeff said, his gaze distant. Jama looked at him, her heart aching for this man, his grief-stricken wife, and of course little Alice. This beloved little girl, who was so needed by her parents, was gone. Meanwhile, Jama, who felt unwanted and unloved, remained alive. Time passed, Jeff repeated. I gradually began to recover, to return to life, but Helen didn't. She was consumed by grief, and she blamed herself for what happened to Alice. She believed that if she had taken time off and walked Alice home like usual, none of this would have happened. Helen was continually burdened by heavy thoughts, weakening day by day. She was visibly deteriorating. Despite therapy and medication, she found no relief. She eventually resigned from her job because her performance was affected, and the thought of facing her boss, who stopped her from seeing her child on that ill-fated day, was unbearable. One day, Jeff arrived home to find Helen upbeat. Her eyes sparkled feverishly, and her cheeks were flushed. "Come in," she said to her husband. "Sit down and eat. I'll check Alice's homework and join you." Jeff was taken aback. "What homework?" he asked. Helen disappeared into their daughter's room, and Jeff followed. At first, he thought he was hallucinating. Alice was sitting at the desk, her back to him, engrossed in her textbooks. She was wearing her favourite avocado pyjamas. The scene was so familiar that it was surreal. Jeff initially thought it was another child, but it was actually a doll, which was actually designed for collectors and had a striking resemblance to real children, so much so that it was even unnerving. In her inconsolable state, Helen ordered a doll that resembled Alice. It was crafted from a photograph of the girl, capturing all her features, including her moles. However, it lacked the warmth of Alice's smile and the curious sparkle in her blue eyes. Jeff found the doll unsettling, and of course he was truly alarmed by his wife's behaviour. Yet Helen seemed happy for the first time since the tragedy. Jeff thought it might be a coping mechanism, or a way for her to accept what had happened. Nothing else had been able to alleviate her depression, but the doll seemed to help. However, Helen's behaviour grew increasingly strange. She treated the doll as if it were their living daughter, preparing Alice's favourite meals, conversing with it, and even buying it clothes. Helen was drifting further from reality. When she decided to take the doll to a children's movie, Jeff realised he needed to take action. He called for medical help. Helen was diagnosed with a serious stress-induced disorder and was admitted to a hospital. After nearly half a year of treatment, Helen's condition improved significantly. She was more aware of reality, although not fully recovered. Despite this, progress was evident. The doctors even allowed her to go home on weekends. Jeff looked forward to these days, but Helen's peculiarities persisted, which was unsettling. For instance, Helen insisted that a doll be in the car, specifically in a child's seat. Although she didn't ask to bring the toy home, she refused to get in the car unless the doll was present. Helen explained her requirement by saying, "I realise that it's not our daughter. It's just comforting to see a familiar picture out of the corner of my eye." Jeff did not object, especially since the doctor stated that this request was harmless. It was merely a method for Helen to gradually and gently transition from her current state. "Doctors are sure that Helen will soon be completely recovered. She just needs to find something to bring her back to reality," Jeff said. Jamer, struggling to find the right words, simply said, "It's so frightening and sad." Jeff responded, "There's plenty of sadness in this world. Here you are, for example, a child who is in such a situation. Let's get in the car, you're freezing, and direct me to your house." Jamer nodded and obediently sat in the passenger seat next to the driver's seat. The doll in the back seat, sitting in the baby booster, no longer seemed so terrifying. Instead, Jamer felt a profound sadness when she looked at it, causing tears to well up in her eyes. "I'm going to the hospital to pick up Helen," Jeff explained. "The doctors allowed me to take her for the weekend, and that's why this doll is here. It's what Helen needs for now." "I see," Jamer responded. "They say I need to find something for her to do, something that will distract and inspire her. It's not an easy task. Helen used to love her job, but now she doesn't want to think about returning." "I think everything will be fine," Jamer attempted to comfort Jeff. "Time, heals." "What happened to you?" The man momentarily took his eyes off the road to look at his young passenger. "Will you tell me?" Jamer hesitated. Jeff had been open and honest with her, sharing his life, his pain, all to ensure she felt safe getting in his car. He knew she would otherwise freeze on the journey. His honesty made it easier to reciprocate, but it would mean talking about the Caldwells and her psychiatric diagnosis. What if he leaves me at the hospital? What if he decides that I am genuinely ill? He's so kind. He didn't ignore an injured dog, Jamer thought. The dog was now resting in the back seat, enjoying the warmth and peace. Surely a man like that would admit a mentally ill girl into a hospital, considering it his duty to help a sick individual. Don't worry. Jeff seemed to notice Jamer's hesitation. Just tell me if you need help, but be honest. If you'd rather things stay as they are, I'll stay out of your life. I promise. But if there's anything I can do to assist you, just let me know. Jamer decided to open up about her life, something she had never done before. She took a deep breath and began to share her story. She spoke about the orphanage, where conditions were harsh, yet no one abused or confined her. She talked about Lucy, the only person she truly missed, and her experiences with the Caldwells. Describing what she had endured in that family proved challenging. As Jamer recounted her time at the Caldwells' farm, Jeff's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He remained silent, listening attentively, only interjecting occasionally to ask clarifying questions. The answers seemed to shock him. Finally, they arrived at Jamer's house. "Well, here we are," Jamer said, smiling at Jeff. "Do you live here? Aren't you cold inside?" Jeff asked. "No, I have a working furnace," she replied. "Listen," Jeff said, turning to look at Jamer. "What you've experienced is awful. The Caldwells are criminals, and they need to be punished." Jamer nodded, a wave of relief washing over her. Jeff believed her without question. "You need to report everything. You need to give a statement to the police." "No," the girl shook her head. "I can't. They'll send me to the hospital. The Caldwells have labelled me as mad. That's why I've been hiding from everyone. I'm scared that if I appear in public, I'll be sent either to the hospital or back to them. I'm unsure which is worse." "Listen closely," the man responded. "You've been manipulated and intimidated. They've done this intentionally, so you won't consider complaining. Any examination will prove that your diagnosis is false. You're a completely healthy child. They exploited your innocence and lack of experience and filled your head with this nonsense. Quite successfully, as it seems." Jamer nodded in agreement. "The way you're living here, this isn't a life for children or anyone. It's mere survival. You need to study, interact with your peers, and grow. Yet, I am still scared." "Consider the other children in this family. Those frightening people might not stop with them. They could bring more children from orphanages and turn their lives into a nightmare. You're strong. You managed to escape. What about the others?" Jamer remembered Mary's anxious eyes, meek Stacy and pale, skinny Hayes. "You might be right. I'll do it," the girl sighed. "Great. I'll go get Helen now while you gather your things. Don't take much. You won't need them in your new life. Just the most essential items." 4 years passed. Jamer had grown up and something significant had happened this year. She became a law student. This was all thanks to Jeff and Helen, who had taken care of her since the day Jeff found her on the road. Initially, they helped Jamer unofficially, and later they took legal custody of her. Jeff returned for Jamer that evening, and he wasn't alone. His wife sat in the passenger seat. She was beautiful and pale, with shadows under her eyes, but her gaze was clearly interested. She did not appear to be an absent, broken woman. Jeff, as soon as he took his wife from the hospital, told her the story of Jamer. Naturally, she was horrified and expressed her desire to put the Caldwells behind bars. "People like that shouldn't be left free," Helen declared. "They are monsters." Jeff agreed with her completely. Helen could help restore justice. As she had been a first-class lawyer, before the unfortunate incident with her daughter. Having heard Jema's story, the woman felt motivated to act for the first time since the tragedy. Helen and Jeff brought Jema from her shabby house to their home, a spacious apartment with clean, comfortable furniture and a warm, fragrant bath. To Jema, these everyday comforts felt incredibly luxurious and elite. Then came the process of recounting her experiences, which was difficult for Jema. Remembering everything that happened and sharing the details was incredibly painful. At times, she couldn't hold back her tears. The thought of possibly having to face her tormentors was, again, unsettling. However, Helen assured Jema that she wouldn't have to meet her foster parents again, a gesture for which Jema was deeply grateful. Jema spent some time in state institutions, starting with a children's hospital. She underwent examinations for 2 weeks. The doctors concluded that she was mentally healthy but slightly worn out, which wasn't surprising given Jema's previous circumstances. Jema found herself back in the orphanage, the same one she had left. Lucy, her old friend, had graduated and was gone. The tutors shrugged off questions about Lucy's fate. "She doesn't keep in touch with us," they said indifferently. Despite this, Jema didn't feel lonely or abandoned. She was frequently visited by Jeff and Helen, who brought gifts and expressed interest in her life. At first, Jema thought their visits were solely related to Helen's case. However, even after Anna and Peter Caldwell were sentenced to long prison terms, their visits continued. Jema realized that Helen's investigation was the case that brought the woman back to life. Helen had regained her vitality. She was once again filled with the desire and strength to fight injustice. Even her appearance changed. Her pallor faded, her gaze became confident and piercing, and her eyes sparkled with a thirst for life. Jema was pleased to witness this transformation. During one visit, Jeff casually asked if Jema would object to them becoming her legal guardians. Jema was thrilled. She had never dared to dream of such a thing. Initially, there were complications, as Helen, a recent psychiatric patient, wasn't considered an ideal candidate for foster parent. Despite this, the couple managed to gain custody of Jema. She began living with them, finally experiencing true happiness. Jeff and Helen never pushed Jema. Instead, they gently guided and advised her, engaging in lengthy conversations. Jema had never felt so needed and happy before. They also searched for Lucy, who lived on the city outskirts in a state-provided apartment for orphans. She worked as a store clerk. Jema was thrilled to reconnect with her friend, and Lucy felt the same. Helen and Jeff brought the Caldwells' youngest children, Mary, Stacy, Hayes, into their family. These children required extensive rehabilitation due to the significant damage to their developing psyches caused by Peter and Anna. Helen, Jeff, and Jema faced a long and challenging task, but they were prepared and eager to restore the children's sense of childhood. The elder Caldwells required more comprehensive care, resulting in their admission to a hospital with psychologists and psychotherapists. But the couple had no intention of leaving the elder Caldwell's children, who had faced greater hardships. They planned to continue their support even after the children's discharge. Despite being adults by law, they were ill-equipped for life in society and needed assistance. Helen became Jema's role model in every aspect. Jema admired her beauty, intelligence, and determination, and all this inspired her to choose law school. Helen wholeheartedly supported her. Soon, Jema would embark on her studies and a new phase of life, and she knew that whenever she felt overwhelmed by the city's hustle and bustle, she could always retreat to Helen and Jeff. They provided a haven where she could rest, receive love and attention, and rejuvenate. The doll, too, had a new home. Helen suggested donating it to an orphanage during the peak of the Caldwell's case. Jeff was happy to take the toy. It meant that his wife had finally recovered. Robin gently applied the brakes. A sharp turn lay ahead, right before a bridge. Given the potential danger, she decided to slow down. Robin wasn't an experienced driver and preferred not to risk unnecessary dangers. Moreover, she was getting married in a month. It was her fiancé who had gifted her this car, not a brand new one, but a used one in good condition. "Of course I don't mind an old car, and I'm deeply grateful for it," she said when he showed it to her. "But why? If money is a problem, I can manage without a car for now." "It's not about the money," Josh replied softly. "I don't see the point in buying a new car when a slightly used one, still in good condition, can be bought for much less. Plus, you just got your license. If anything happens, you won't feel as bad about damaging this car as you would a new one." "Are you implying I didn't study hard enough?" Robin feigned insult. "No, not at all," Josh laughed. "I remember what it was like to be a beginner myself. Once you're a bit more comfortable, we can consider a newer car." "Yes, I suppose you're right," Robin agreed. Yes, Josh's arguments were rational, and his frugal lifestyle, rooted in a philosophy of prudent economy, was one of the reasons she had chosen him over other suitors. While Josh assured her there was no financial issues, she knew the truth was more nuanced. He had money, but it wasn't prudent to spend it on lavish purchases, especially now. For years, Josh had been developing his own business, which demanded substantial investment, including financial. Of course, in some ways it was easier for him than others. He got the money to open his business from his parents, who were successful businessmen. In addition, they were able to give him some valuable advice. But that was the end of their participation in the business of their favourite son. From childhood, he was taught to be independent. Robin came from a modest but not impoverished family. Her parents were middle managers who earned a decent income and had no ambitions for starting their own business. Robin followed their path, working at several firms and making some career progress before meeting Josh. During their relationship, Josh offered her a position in his company, not just any position, but as his partner. "Absolutely not," she declined firmly. "I lack the experience for such an important role." "I don't have a lot either," Josh countered. "I'm learning as I go." "But you have some knowledge from your parents and experience in running your own business. I'm just not ready for that." "Okay, how about this? You join me at the same level you're at now, and we'll enhance your skills and knowledge until you're ready to be a full partner. If something happens to me, who better to run the business than my wife?" "Oh, don't say that. Nothing bad is going to happen to you," Robin, who was somewhat superstitious, retorted. And now Robin was heading home from work. Her fiancé, as usual, remained at the office with more work on his plate. This was the primary reason why Robin had obtained her driver's license and needed a car. Without it, commuting from the city office to their country cottage wasn't very convenient. Suddenly, Robin sensed something amiss. She needed to make a right turn, but despite her best efforts, the car continued moving straight. The bridge's railing, which seemed too weak, was already in sight. It was evident that the railing wouldn't hold up against the weight of the car, even at a slow speed. Overwhelmed with panic, Robin couldn't comprehend what was happening. In desperation, she pressed the brake pedal to the floor. But it was too late. The car had rammed into the railing and plunged into the river, sinking slowly as if in slow motion. Overwhelmed by the impact, stress, or a combination of both, she lost consciousness. A traffic jam began to form on the shore as onlookers stopped and exited their vehicles. A crowd gradually gathered on the bridge, watching the unfolding tragedy with a sense of helplessness. Everyone wanted to help, but no one knew how. "Shouldn't we call an ambulance?" someone suggested. "What's the use of an ambulance "We need emergency services," someone else retorted. "The paramedics aren't going to dive into icy water, are they? By the time they arrive, she'll have drowned." "Why doesn't someone call for help? For God's sake! If you're so smart, why don't you call?" Someone called either the rescuers or the doctors, but it was painfully clear they wouldn't arrive in time. A bright red car was sinking deeper into the water, carrying the woman behind the wheel with it. Time was running out. No one in the crowd knew where the man in dirty, ragged clothes had come from. He hadn't arrived in a car. Before anyone could react, he discarded his old jacket and without hesitation plunged into the cold water. By the time this mysterious stranger reached the car, it was completely submerged in the turbulent river. Then he dived in. The crowd seemed to hold its breath along with the brave man. Noise ceased instantly, and an eerie silence enveloped the scene. A minute passed, a second, a third, and finally the brave man's head appeared above the water. Making powerful strokes with his arms, he was clearly dragging something heavy behind him. The crowd's tension, which had momentarily subsided, surged with renewed intensity. Uncertainty hung in the air, as it was unclear whether the woman was still alive or if the man had merely eased the rescue service's work by retrieving her body. Ignoring the spectators, the hero reached the shore and gently placed the woman on the ground. He immediately began resuscitation efforts. After a few tense seconds, Robin coughed, spat out water, and opened her eyes. She could only stare at her saviour in stunned gratitude, wordlessly expressing her thanks. When the ambulance finally arrived, the crowd that had gathered near the bridge erupted in applause and jubilant shouts. Amidst the chaos, the mysterious man who had helped out vanished without anyone noticing, and leaving behind him his shabby jacket. Robin was rushed to the hospital. A few hours later, her fiancé arrived. The doctors informed him about the incident. He blamed himself for the accident, knowing that the car's malfunction, which he had overlooked when buying, was likely the cause. "And all due to my foolish desire to save money," he thought, guilt-ridden. "I should have bought a new car with a warranty for my beloved, or at the very least, I should not have skimped on a proper diagnosis. Instead, I believed the previous owner, who claimed the car had been recently serviced and was trouble-free." Upon seeing Robin, Josh exclaimed, "Honey, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine now," she replied soothingly. "The doctors say it's a miracle I didn't sustain any serious injuries from the fall. It could have ended much worse if not for the help of a kind stranger." "Who was he?" Josh inquired. "Did he leave some contacts? We should thank him." "I don't know. He looked like a vagrant. He didn't leave anything. In fact, he left so quickly that he even forgot his things. Poor guy." "Then all the more reason to find him," said Josh confidently. "If he's a vagrant, he must need help himself." Knowing her fiancé's stubbornness, Robin did not argue with him. From her perspective, it was not worth disturbing the man who had made it clear he did not want attention. However, changing Josh's mind was impossible. He began to search for the unknown vagrant with enthusiasm. He even went to that ill-fated bridge and searched the nearby area. Furthermore, he used all his connections, which finally led to a result. It turned out that CCTV cameras near the scene had recorded the incident, and Josh managed to get the footage. As it turned out, the stranger often walked on the bridge, usually accompanied by a large, shaggy dog. The man's face was clearly visible in some shots, and he always approached from the same side. This information was enough for the determined Josh. Armed with printouts of frames from the camera, he revisited the bridge and tried to retrace the man's known route. When he lost the trail, he asked passers-by for help. Many recognized the man with the large and reportedly friendly dog, but no one could pinpoint where he lived. Undeterred, Josh returned to the area repeatedly, questioning passers-by. He always carried a small bag with him, containing a new jacket he'd bought for the man. He felt this was particularly important with winter approaching. However, no one could tell him where the man lived. After 3 weeks of fruitless searching, Josh's enthusiasm was not dampened. Instead, his failures only spurred him on, fueling his desire to continue his search with increased fervour. All the while, his own wedding was fast approaching. Finally, his efforts were rewarded. One day, upon arrival at his destination, he was surprised to find a large, shaggy black dog, the very same one he had seen in video recordings. Despite the similarity of all the other dogs, he could recognize this particular one from a mile away. Beside the dog stood its owner, a man about Josh's age but alarmingly thin. This impression was emphasized by his clothing. He wore only a light windbreaker, despite the months not being particularly warm. As Josh approached the stranger, he contemplated how to initiate the conversation. He still believed that his search was due to good fortune rather than his own efforts. However, he was mistaken. The stranger spoke first, and his tone was far from friendly. "I take it you're the one who's been snooping around here for weeks, asking about me and showing people pictures of me." "Yes, that's me," Josh responded. He was so startled by the confrontation that his planned responses flew right out of his head. He was unsure how to react to such a frosty welcome, and certainly didn't anticipate the tramp's hostility. "And why, may I ask, do you need me?" "Well, you see," Josh began, regaining his composure, "you've rescued my fiancée. You remember, right, the woman who fell off the bridge in her car? You pulled her out and administered first aid." "Yeah, well, it's difficult to forget such an experience." The stranger's tone softened a bit. "Let's go and talk in my hut if you'd like. The atmosphere might not seem too cosy, but that's the way it is." Josh noticed the tramp seemed eager to leave the crowded place as quickly as possible. This behaviour matched what he had observed on the cameras. The man avoided large crowds, preferring to walk his dog when the streets were empty. As Josh considered the implications of this secrecy, the man and his dog led him through some dark back alleys. It didn't take them long to navigate. In about 10 minutes they arrived at an apparently abandoned house on the outskirts, which was their destination. "Are you hiding from someone?" Josh couldn't contain his curiosity. "What makes you say that?" his companion replied sharply. "No, I'm just—" Josh hesitated, then quickly changed the subject. "What's your name, anyway?" "Barney." "My name is Josh. Nice to meet you. I didn't mean to offend you by bringing you here, but you left your jacket on the bridge. It seemed to me that you may not be able to afford to lose it," he said, handing Barney a package with his jacket. Barney accepted the jacket calmly, saying simply, "Thank you." The two men sat in silence for a moment. Josh surveyed the desolate house, as vacant and neglected on the inside as it appeared from the outside. The only sign of life was a pile of rags in the corner, a makeshift bed for a dog. "You shouldn't live like this," Josh murmured. "I understand that things must be difficult for you. Maybe I can help you." Barney shook his head. The conversation had reached a dead end. Barney was clearly not open to speak, and Josh was at a loss for how to proceed. The awkward silence was broken only by the sound of the dog chewing something in the corner, oblivious to the human tension. "At least come to our wedding, okay?" Josh tried again. "It's in a few days. Don't worry about attire or transportation. I'll take care of everything. Please come. I think Robin would be pleased." "Yeah? But who will I leave the dog with?" Barney muttered. "Well, if it's a real issue, there are solutions. Pet hotels exist, or I've heard that individuals can temporarily care for pets. But honestly, I don't think leaving him alone for a few hours is a problem. After all, he wasn't with you when you rescued Robin." The discussion continued for a while. Barney made up the most ridiculous excuses not to go to the wedding. Josh, in return, was entering the very state of excitement that did not let him stop looking for the mysterious stranger. He was ready to argue late into the night to convince Barney. Eventually, sensing this, Barney relented. "All right," he conceded. "I'll attend, but not for long." Josh worried that Barney said this purely to pacify him. He feared that on the big day Barney would simply not appear at the restaurant, return all his gifts, apologise, and claim something absurd like his dog being ill. Josh was so uncertain about Barney's attendance that he didn't even inform Robin. He reasoned that if Barney did show up, it would be a pleasant surprise. If not, the bride wouldn't be disappointed on her wedding day because she hadn't been given false hope. However, despite the circumstances, Barney arrived, but he stayed away from the general festivities, talked to no one, and answered all questions briefly. But he did show up. It seemed his word was unbreakable, which made Josh respect the peculiar wanderer even more. And everything seemed to be going well, except that he noticed that the bride, who had been cheerful and satisfied with her life since the morning, had fallen into some kind of gloom, or into some kind of thoughtfulness. No, of course she was smiling, chatting amiably with the guests and all that, but Josh knew his beloved too well to realise something was going wrong. "Honey, are you all right?" he quietly asked when he got the chance. "Why did you bring Barney here?" she responded directly. Caught off guard, Josh stammered. He probably expected any response but this one. "I thought you'd be happy to see him," he replied, dumbfounded. "Of course I'm glad, but that's the issue. He's not pleased to be here at all. I can't figure out why. Actually, I might have an idea. He's just a wanderer with no home, surrounded by wealth and success. How do you think it makes him feel? He's been pulled from his familiar world, plunged into all this luxury, to entertain the fiancée of a rich businessman, and then he'll be shoved back into his miserable life." "I don't think that's the situation," Josh responded seriously. "I offered him various kinds of help, but he declined. He refused to work for me or accept money. It's as if he prefers his miserable life. But you're correct about one thing. He clearly didn't want to come here. Perhaps I shouldn't have persuaded him so much. I don't understand why I was so determined." "But I know why," Robin laughed, but she failed to continue her thought, if indeed she was going to do so. The toastmaster, who had been providing some background entertainment without really capturing the guests' attention, finally started some silly contests and other activities, demanding the audience's compulsory participation. "And you, young man, what are you doing standing idle?" he suddenly asked, clearly addressing Barney. Barney had thought his duty was done. He had kept his promise and planned to leave quietly, without drawing attention, but now all eyes were on him. The toastmaster continued, "It's come to my attention that this wedding wouldn't have happened without this young man. Just imagine, if the bride had drowned, we'd all be here, but not celebrating, but mourning." "Where did you find him?" Robin snapped at her new husband. "Are you trying to save money again?" "No, actually," Josh replied, taken aback. "Actually, my acquaintances recommended him to me. I guess there was something I didn't know about the specificity of their humour." "Well, young man," the toastmaster continued, "don't be shy. Come forward and congratulate our newlyweds." Barney slowly climbed onto the stage as if battling a physical barrier. He fumbled with the microphone, seemingly unfamiliar with it. He began with a few clichés, then surprisingly presented the newlyweds with a heartfelt song. The lyrics spoke of boundless love, and his beautiful sensual vocals were a pleasant surprise. He was met with thunderous applause upon finishing, which seemed to embarrass him. As if snapping back to reality, he quickly handed the microphone back to the toastmaster, exited the stage, and soon left the celebration. Intrigued by Barney's strange behaviour, Josh nevertheless respected his privacy and didn't make any attempts to contact the strange man. And to his great joy, his patience paid off in an unexpected way. Within a week, The answers to his questions found him, albeit not in the way he had anticipated. Josh had just finished his work for the day and was about to leave when his cell phone rang. To his surprise, the caller was an old acquaintance, an investigator on high-profile cases with whom he hadn't spoken in years. Negative thoughts began to emerge. "Hello, Neil. It's been an age since we last spoke. Is this just a casual call, or is it about work?" Josh asked. "Well, we haven't spoken in a while, but not long enough for you to forget that I don't just call for fun," the stern voice replied. With a heavy sigh, Josh asked, "All right, how can I assist? Or am I under suspicion? Although if that were the case, you wouldn't have called. You would have shown up in person, right?" "Correct. This is about your recent wedding, or more specifically, one of your guests." A pang of fear struck Josh's heart. He had no doubt which guest he was talking about. Thoughts began racing through his mind, ranging from regret for inviting this stranger to the wedding to a firm belief that Barney wasn't involved in anything criminal. After all, Barney didn't strike him as a criminal, let alone one who would be of interest to investigators of serious crimes. A video of a young man singing a heartfelt love song has gone viral. Josh's companion continued. "It's incredibly popular, and deservedly so. Even I enjoyed it. But that's beside the point. We're interested in the singer." "What is your interest in the singer?" "I shouldn't disclose that. But taking into account our old friendship, I'll reveal some details. This man is a suspect in an old, serious case. It might not be him, but I'm confident in my intuition. It was a high-profile case. Perhaps you've heard of it. There was a helicopter transporting gold from northern mines. Your guest worked there as a pilot. Reliable for a long time, no issues. Except during one flight, something went terribly wrong. There was a catastrophic accident. The helicopter was damaged, and everyone on board died. Well, almost everyone. 3 bodies were found, but the crew was 4. All were identified except the pilot, and the gold was missing. A substantial amount of gold." "And you think it was the pilot who killed everyone and hid himself with the gold, right?" Josh asked for some reason. "Well, I can't think of any other possibilities. I actually wanted to ask you this. How would we find him, to communicate, so to speak? I know he must be a friend of yours, but you know me, if he's innocent, he has nothing to fear. Or maybe it's not even the same person at all. It'll be easy to find out nowadays." Well, well, well. You'll promise anything to get the information you need, Josh thought irritably, and then said aloud, "Unfortunately, I can't help you with that. He's not a friend of mine. I have no contact with him. I have no idea where he lives." "And how, in that case, did he happen to be at your wedding?" the investigator asked ingratiatingly. "It was pure chance. You see, just a month before the wedding, he saved my wife. Really? She was in an accident. Her car fell into the river and he pulled her out and resuscitated her. We invited him over as a thank you, so he came." "I see," said Neil. "Well, let's check it out. And you, if you find out anything, then—" "Of course, I'll call," Josh answered briefly before hanging up the phone. He paced around the office, unsure of his next move. Something didn't add up. Barney had made a positive impression on him, not only because he had saved Robin, which was important, of course. But would a hardened criminal save a stranger by jumping into cold water, risking discovery in the process? No. He would have passed by quietly, avoiding any adverse consequences. Besides, why would Barney live as a vagabond if he had stolen a large amount of valuable gold? With that much wealth, he could start a completely new life, make documents, travel abroad, and live in luxury without denying himself anything. Yet he lives in a dilapidated, abandoned house with a dog. Speaking of the dog, they say dogs resemble their owners. Despite its ferocity, this dog was a calm and harmless creature. There were also arguments supporting the alternate option, specifically Barney's peculiar behaviour. He seemed to be evading someone or something. Could it be the police? Moreover, who's to say the police are always correct, never pursuing the innocent? Ultimately, Josh concluded that the best course of action was to confront Barney and inquire directly. He would seek answers and subsequently decide the next step. Despite being warned that Barney might be a ruthless killer, Josh didn't perceive any threat. Perhaps he was reluctant to believe it. However, upon nearing the house, Josh realized that he was too late. A large black dog, evidently distraught, was in front of the rundown building. Barney was nowhere in sight. It seemed the police had beaten him to it. They certainly had more resources for the search than he initially did when looking for the peculiar stranger. Josh approached the dog and spoke affectionate words that held no meaning. The dog peered at him from under its brow, growled menacingly, but after a sniff, clearly recognized him. With melancholic eyes, the dog walked up to Josh and sat at his feet, accepting a pat on the scruff of its neck. "Don't worry," Josh reassured. "We'll rescue your master." Then the man opened the car door, gesturing invitingly. The dog looked at him with disbelief, but eventually hopped into the cabin. On the drive, Josh dialed his wife's number, contemplating how best to explain the situation, but no suitable explanation came to mind. By the way, Josh indeed was only half an hour late. By the time he received a call from Neil, the police already had a rough idea of where to search for the suspect. It wasn't hard for them to scour the area and locate an abandoned house. Barney surrendered without resistance, only requesting to find someone to care for his dog. Unfortunately, even that wish was denied. At the police station, Barney was taken in for questioning. The stern investigator seemed to be against him from the start. Barney was familiar with this type of person. They weren't interested in uncovering the truth. The investigator already had a preconceived notion of what had transpired, and any contradicting facts were disregarded. "Barney Petrov, correct?" the investigator asked sternly. "Yes, that's me," Barney grudgingly admitted. Was there any point in denying it? Claiming it was a case of mistaken identity wouldn't work. A DNA test would quickly prove that he was the pilot who vanished after the helicopter crash, only making his situation worse. "Do you understand why we've called you here?" "I wouldn't exactly say I was invited," Barney retorted. "But yes, I understand why I'm of interest. You believe I'm responsible for the deaths of 3 people, a crashed helicopter, and a significant amount of missing gold. Correct?" "See? It's not difficult at all." The investigator suddenly smiled, envisioning another commendation on his uniform. "What's not difficult?" "To confess to the crimes you've committed is admirable. Your cooperation with the investigation will be taken into account." "Wait a minute," Barney objected. "I didn't confess to anything. I merely stated the charges you could bring against me at your request, but I didn't admit to actually doing it." "That's interesting. So, how do you explain what happened?" "I was set up. There was no gold in the helicopter. We were transporting some kind of waste under the pretense of it being gold. I discovered this after the crash when the bags burst open. The helicopter was damaged just before the flight. They probably hoped someone would survive to take the blame, or maybe some escaped convicts if they all died. It's a tough place up north, with plenty of criminals." "That sounds very plausible," the investigator snorted, not hiding his skepticism. "But if you're innocent, why have you been hiding all this time? Why didn't you go to the police immediately and tell them everything as it happened?" "Well, I have to say,
The crash didn't go without a trace for me. I was severely injured and lost my memory. Locals found me and took me to the hospital where I stayed for a few months. I left with no money, no ID, and no knowledge of who I was or where I came from. I had no recollection of who might need me. I ended up homeless and roamed the streets for a long time, switched cities, and then a dog found me. Interestingly, that's when my memory started to return. I'm not sure what the connection is. Perhaps there's none, but 2 years later I finally regained my memory. But who would I turn to? Who would believe me? Even now you don't believe me. I didn't want to end up in jail, and I had grown accustomed to the nomadic lifestyle. I would have carried on living peacefully, not bothering anyone, if it weren't for that damn wedding. Unsurprisingly, the investigator did not believe Barney, and the man was sent to a detention centre to await trial, the result of which seemed inevitable. Barney seemed resigned to his fate and was more concerned about his dog. Neil had just finished an interrogation and was about to call Josh, but Josh beat him to it. As soon as Neil turned on his phone, which he always kept off during work, it was inundated with messages about numerous attempts to reach him, followed by another call. "Hello again," the investigator responded. "Are you concerned about your friend, whose whereabouts you claim not to know?" That was intentionally misleading the investigation. What were you thinking? I saw on the camera how you were searching for him, and how you had finally met up with him. "Listen, Neil, I don't believe that Barney could have killed anyone," Josh stated bluntly. "You don't need to believe it. The facts are all lined up, and there's no concrete evidence of his innocence. His explanation is absurd." "Do you have any proof of his guilt?" Josh asked. "Think about it, Neil. Would a murderer risk his life to save a stranger?" "People change," the investigator replied philosophically, "but that doesn't absolve them of responsibility for past crimes." "Well, then what about the gold? Neil, he must have had a lot of money, right? If he really did what you suspect him of, why is he living like a bum in some abandoned hovel?" "Who knows? Maybe he stole it, but didn't know what to do with it. He was just an ordinary working man, not familiar with jewellery, so he got overwhelmed by the money he was close to. It happens. And he got nothing but trouble out of it. And yet—" "Josh," interrupted Neil, "I'll give you some advice. Instead of trying to persuade me, you'd better talk to your friend. Convince him that cooperating with the investigation is his best option. Make him tell us the truth. Make him repent and show us where he hid the gold. He must have it somewhere. He'll get credit. He'll get the minimum sentence. And then he'll be out on parole for good behaviour. That's the best option I can offer you." "I'll think about it," Josh said dryly, and hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He was seething with rage. Now he was absolutely convinced of Barney's innocence. The poor man was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. What evidence did they have against him? Didn't their country uphold the presumption of innocence? Ignoring Neil's advice, Josh hired the best lawyer he could find for Barney. The cost was substantial, but the man felt responsible for the unfortunate individual. After all, it was Josh's wedding where he was discovered. The lawyer was competent and well versed in the case. During the trial he convincingly argued that without evidence, witnesses, or surveillance footage from the scene, there was no reason to believe one version over the other. The prosecution's story also had many unresolvable issues. For instance, how could Barney have single-handedly stolen and hidden such a large amount of gold? And Barney's good reputation with his superiors, he was responsible, hard-working and reliable, also worked in his favour. Despite some difficulty, Barney was acquitted. He left the courtroom a free man with no legal issues. However, he still had no home, job or property, and he had no idea how to start his new life. "I need to find my dog first," he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. "No need," Josh responded. "We have him. I picked him up right after they took you away. I thought it'd be trouble, but he's a good dog. He's obedient, doesn't jump, and doesn't make a mess in the house." "Of course," Barney smiled. "I didn't just pick him up. I raised him as best I could. And it worked out great. But think, where will you take him? Are you going to wander the streets again? Or go back to your shack? It could collapse on you. Don't do it." "So, what else can I do?" "There is something. Come work for me. I can't pay much yet, but it's enough to live on. Plus I'll rent you an apartment as my employee. It's a good arrangement. We'll find a place that allows dogs." "It's kind of embarrassing. You've already helped me so much." Barney hesitated. "I've only got you out of the mess I put you in," Josh objected. "And I still haven't thanked you for saving Robin. Believe me, her life means a lot to me." "I don't really have any skills." Barney continued to hesitate. "Except for flying a helicopter, and not very well at that. Skills diminish, machines improve. It's a constant need for retraining, and you probably don't need a pilot, do you?" "I don't need a pilot, but a driver could be useful. It's not in my rank to drive myself anymore." "Can you drive a car?" "I can, but I need to renew my license." "Well, that's not a problem." And so the deal was sealed. As promised by Josh, Barney and his dog moved into a spacious apartment near the office. Barney's life began to improve, and he barely recalled his past. There was only one regret. Once, a long time ago, he had a fiancée, Grace. Where she was now or who she was with, he didn't know. He was certain she had abandoned him after the helicopter crash. But he didn't blame her. She must have had her own life, and her feelings for him had faded. Barney's duty involved driving Josh around, primarily to various business negotiations. Usually he waited in the car, but occasionally he was offered to sit in the lobby of the offices or restaurants. The man typically declined, feeling out of place in posh interiors, expensive offices, or fancy restaurants. One day, Barney took Josh to the office to meet with prospective investors. He hadn't even had breakfast that morning, so he accepted the offer to wait for his boss in the office and have a cup of tea. The negotiations had been going on for over an hour when suddenly a woman came out of the meeting room. Barney also noticed another man involved in the negotiations from the corner of his eye and was taken aback. Despite the passing of time, he couldn't fail to recognize these people, especially the woman. He knew every feature of her face better than his own, as she was once his bride in his past life. Yes, it was his beloved Grace. And her companion was Craig, his superior, who had sent him on that doomed journey. As Barney now vividly recalled, he wasn't the intended person to make that flight. However, Craig had insisted, stating that the task was too important to entrust to just anyone. A gullible Barney had no idea that in fact either death or years in prison lay ahead of him. But for both swindlers, either option would have been a good fit. Barney was now sure about who had set him up with the transportation and who had taken all the gold that was falsely implicated on him. Besides, he saw that this couple cooed sweetly and exchanged some tenderness. They were clearly in a romantic relationship. Everything clicked into place. They were the ones responsible for his troubles. And then he literally burst into the room and, without realizing his own actions, with fists attacked the former boss, shouting accusations and insults. It took considerable effort for Josh to pull Barney away from the potential partner. "Is this how you negotiate now?" the victim asked sternly. "We didn't agree on everything, certainly, but not to this extent." "I apologize for this terrible incident," Josh started. "Boss, you shouldn't have any dealings with them," Barney interrupted. "They're crooks and murderers. Trust me." "Calm down," Josh shouted at him, "and leave the office. We'll deal with this later." Reluctantly, Barney obeyed. Once back in the car, he tried to still the tremors in his hands and wipe away the tears that had welled up in his eyes. Josh returned 10 minutes later to put it mildly, in a bad mood. "The negotiations are ruined," he nearly shouted. "I had high hopes for these people. Very respectable people, by the way. They could be investors in my project. I hope I convinced them to reconsider, but there are no guarantees. What on earth happened to you?" Nervously and with a stutter that occasionally broke into near hysterical sobs, Barney tried to explain what had transpired. Josh listened to him without interruption, but Barney had the impression that his words weren't entirely believed. "I've spent so much time with this woman, wouldn't I recognise her? And my ex-boss hasn't changed much." "Well, let's say," Josh said slowly, "but are you sure it was them who set you up?" "Who else could it be? It's obvious." "Obvious? You know, the investigator I know used to say that about a man whom the court later found completely innocent. Doesn't that remind you of anything?" "That's not the same thing at all." Barney was taken aback. "Sounds exactly the same to me," replied Josh. "The same kind of accusations based on a person's prejudices? Don't know what happened to that helicopter for sure. And yes, maybe she wasn't cheating on you then. Maybe she married Craig more recently. Anyway, but it's none of your business or mine. It's all in the past. And you shouldn't accuse people unless you have 100% proof." "But—" "No buts. This conversation is over," Josh interrupted. "If you ever pull such a prank again, I regret to inform you, but I'll have to let you go. Friendship aside, I won't allow anyone to jeopardize my business." For a while, it seemed as if they had chosen to forget the confrontation. Barney continued to drive Josh to meetings as usual, but he never saw his ex-fiancée and her husband again. He even nurtured a hope that Josh had heeded his advice and was seeking more dependable partners. However, he was soon to discover how wrong he was. One Monday morning, when he went to pick up Josh for his work as usual, he found only Robin at home. To say she was upset would be an understatement. She was near panic. "He left for a meeting out of town Friday night," she said. "What do you mean, a meeting?" Barney was taken aback. "He let me off early on Friday. Who drove him?" "He went himself. He said he didn't want you there." "My God," whispered Barney, beginning to understand. Was he negotiating with Craig Harris? "With him," Robin replied, looking at him hopefully. "I've already contacted him. He said everything went well and Josh went home the same day. He never saw him again." For the next few days, Barney literally lived with the dog at Robin's house and supported her as best he could, grappling with the daunting wish of revealing a terrible truth he was almost certain of. The likelihood of them ever seeing Josh alive again was slim. His suspicion was further confirmed when he learned that Josh's company had somehow ended up under the Harrises' control. Allegedly, Josh had signed a power of attorney for him, and while he was missing, Craig was to run the business as a primary investor. The only thing Barney couldn't do was prove his suspicions. But soon he faced one more significant problem. The secretary who worked in the Harris' office gave testimony that Barney could be responsible for his boss's disappearance. She speculated that if he could suddenly lash out at others, he might also have killed his boss, and then an old accusation resurfaced. Although the court acquitted him, suspicion lingered, and the police were eager to close the case quickly. Robin's help with the lawyer and Barney's good relationships with neighbours, whom he always assisted, saved the man. Several people aware of his predicament provided testimony. Many had seen him walking his dog on the previous Friday night, leading to the dismissal of the charges. The police have not yet taken any more action, citing the fact that Josh could have simply gone to his mistress or some friends, or just to get away to relax from home. Upon his release from the police station, Barney was surprised to see that Robin had managed to pull herself together and he finally had the opportunity to share his account of events so they could plan their next steps together. She believed him unconditionally, but she had no idea how to prove it. She also needed to protect her husband's business to ensure their livelihood, especially since Robin was now responsible not only for herself. Not long before Josh's disappearance, the couple had learned that they were expecting a child. Finally, Barney and Robin divided the duties. Robin, with the assistance of Josh's parents, began to sue Craig for the business. In the meantime, Barney searched for the missing boss. He travelled all possible routes in the area where the negotiations had taken place, interviewing people and reviewing camera footage that some concerned roadside business owners agreed to show him. After about a month, they had a breakthrough. The camera at one of the cafes had captured the car they were looking for. Now the direction of the search was clearer. Barney meticulously searched within several kilometres of this location, and finally he succeeded. He discovered a remote pond on the outskirts of a forest. The area was picturesque and could attract tourists, if it weren't so far from even the most remote villages and cottage communities. Presumably, this is why the criminals chose this spot. Instead of crowds of vacationers, Josh's half-submerged car was sadly bobbing on the water's surface. Barney had dived into the icy pond before, and once again he didn't hesitate to do so. The car was empty, but miraculously the video recorder was unscathed. He made it to shore, clutching the valuable gadget. He wasn't sure if the video would be saved or if there would be anything useful to the investigation, but it was worth a try. The submerged car was a significant clue. Surely it would prompt the police to investigate its owner's whereabouts. With these thoughts, Barney called the police. As he waited for their arrival, he decided to view the footage. It was a difficult task, but his feelings were bitter after watching it. He now had undeniable evidence of the Harrises' guilt. Barney's former boss was the last person to drive this car. Grace was sitting near, and the tied-up Josh was in the back seat. The horrifying recording was cut short, just before the car, along with its helpless owner, was driven into the pond. On the one hand, Barney was satisfied that the criminals would finally be punished. But the price was too high, and Josh would never come back. With a heavy heart, Barney handed the recorder over to the police and went to see Robin. Once the authorities had all the evidence they needed, Craig and Grace were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a long prison term. It wasn't just because of Josh's death. During that one-way trip, the criminal couple had told Josh in colour how they had planned the robbery and framed Barney. Time went on. Barney continued to support Robin and take care of her and then of her newborn son. However, over time their friendship, strengthened by shared adversity, blossomed into love. By the time Robin's son started school, they got married. The past troubles and sorrows hadn't vanished, but they had faded into distant memories. The family had its own traditions. For instance, every Sunday they visited the park with their son and their energetic, elderly dog. During one of these outings they noticed a beggar asking for alms. Before they knew it, two things happened at once. Firstly, their compassionate son approached the poor man to offer him his bun. Secondly, their dog, usually indifferent to strangers, approached the man wagging its tail and attempted to lick his face. That's when Barney managed to get a better look at him. "Josh!" he exclaimed in surprise, causing Robin to be taken aback. "Do you know me?" asked the beggar, hopefully petting the dog. "Forgive me for asking. I once woke up on the shore of a distant pond, with no memories of what happened before." Barney couldn't find the strength to respond. Tears welled in his eyes. He rushed towards his old friend, embracing him. "It's all right," he reassured. "We'll help you remember. It's wonderful that you're alive." Now it was Barney's turn to support Josh in every possible way. Gradually, in familiar surroundings, Josh's memory started to return. Then they all faced an unexpected problem. Josh, having just regained his identity, discovered that his wife was now with another man, who was raising his son. Naturally, this was a devastating blow. For some time, he misbehaved. He drank, visited Robin's and Barney's house and caused scenes. But the couple did not retaliate or condemn him. Instead, they continued to support him. Then a few months later, Josh unexpectedly showed up at their doorstep, completely sober and looking guilty. "Friends, I'm sorry," he said. "I've been away for almost 7 years. You had to live your own lives here, and I shouldn't have reacted so strongly." "It's okay," Barney replied. "You're back with us now. You've always been impulsive, so it's not surprising. We've been waiting for you to come to your senses. There's just one important question." "What's that?" Josh asked. "Business," Barney answered briefly. "We've made a lot of progress over the years, but at least a third of everything we have belongs to you." Josh dismissed the idea. "Forget about this idea. I don't want it. I'll find a quiet job somewhere. I've had enough of entrepreneurship for a lifetime. It's a risky business." In the end, they agreed that Barney would send Josh a certain amount every month to repay his part of the business. This arrangement satisfied everyone. Tired of the city's hustle and bustle, Josh decided to move to the countryside. He found a suitable village with a house for sale. However, when he arrived to inspect it, the house's condition seemed very depressing. A woman in a wheelchair watched him from the neighbouring house for a while before approaching to start a conversation. "Don't get too excited about this house," she warned. "It looks bad on the outside, but believe me, it's even worse on the inside. Without a trained eye, you wouldn't know how bad it is. That's why it's so cheap." "What a pity," Josh responded. "I liked your village and wanted to settle here, but it seems there are no other houses for sale." "Well," she said, "the morning is wiser than the evening. It's late already. Where are you planning to go for a night? You may stay here, and in the morning we'll figure out how to resolve your problem." Josh agreed to stay at that woman's house for the night. Coincidentally, she was also named Robin. Previously, she had been a milkmaid, but an encounter with an unruly bull left her injured. From then on, she managed as best she could, relying on the kindness of her neighbours. Long story short, but Josh didn't just stay for a night. Initially, Josh assisted her with minor tasks, but ultimately decided to stay and began extensive repairs. He also found the right doctors and paid for Robin's costly surgery to repair her lower spine. This was followed by 6 months of rigorous rehabilitation, during which he was a constant support. Finally, she was able to take her first step. In the meantime, Josh purchased the neighbouring house and land, merging it with Robin's property. He equipped the farm, acquired livestock, and hired workers. Essentially, he was back in business, albeit a different one. A couple of years later, they had a boisterous village wedding. Naturally, they invited Barney, Robin, their children, and even the dog. And Josh's bride was dancing with him, outperforming many of the younger, healthier guests.